Hello guys, welcome to Harryverse X. Today we have an incredible story for you. What if Percy Jackson and Thor rescued Harry from Dursleys at age 5 and Demigod Asgardian magic storm? If you enjoy the video, please like and subscribe. Let's get into it. Chapter 1, The Smell of Rain on Hot Pavement. The thing about Surrey in July was that it never quite decided what kind of weather it wanted to be. The sky would go grey and threatening by morning, tease the possibility of a proper storm all afternoon, and then give up by evening and settle into a thick, humid nothing that made the back of your neck sweat and your temper go short. Percy Jackson had been walking through it for 3 hours and he was thoroughly done with England. He had Riptide in his pocket, uncapped, because he'd learned years ago that pentasword transformation time could be the difference between alive and not, and a folded piece of paper in his other hand with an address scrawled in Annabeth's precise handwriting. She'd tracked the artifact's magical signature to a residential street in a town called Little Whinging, which Percy thought sounded like a complaint rather than a place name, and told him to retrieve it quietly. Quietly, she'd said. Underlined twice. Percy had nodded seriously and then immediately started planning contingencies for when quiet didn't work out. The street was called Privet Drive, which also sounded like a complaint. Number 4 was indistinguishable from numbers 2, 3, and 5, the same beige bricks, the same aggressively trimmed hedges, the same sense that the people inside had decided long ago that standing out in any way was a personal failure. The lawn was immaculate. The car in the driveway was large and freshly washed. The garden gnomes, actual ceramic ones, Percy noted, not the biting magical kind he'd once encountered outside a place called the Burrow during a quest that had taken him briefly and confusingly through Wizarding England, were arranged in a way that suggested someone had measured the distances between them. Percy stood at the garden gate and looked at the house. The artifact was inside. He could feel it the way he always felt things connected to his father, a low pull somewhere behind his sternum, like a tide going out. Whatever it was old, and it was powerful, and it had ended up in there somehow, which was going to make retrieving it a conversation Percy was not looking forward to. He opened the gate. The hinge squeaked. From inside the house, a curtain moved. Percy was halfway up the front path when he stopped. There was a cupboard under the stairs. He knew this because the house was a standard layout and the space beneath the staircase was visible from the side window, and because he'd grown up learning to read buildings the way Annabeth had taught him, exits, structure, load-bearing walls, places people hid things or people. But that wasn't why he'd stopped. He'd stopped because there was a small, thin hand pressed flat against the inside of the cupboard door's air vent, fingers pale and still as someone who'd learned not to make noise, and because the artifact's pull was coming from there. From inside the cupboard. From whatever was inside the cupboard. Percy stood very still on the garden path for one long second. The July heat pressed down on him. A lawnmower droned somewhere 3 streets over. He looked at the hand through the vent, the fingers barely wider than pencils, the knuckles slightly scraped, and something cold and very specific settled in his chest. He knocked on the front door. The woman who opened it was blonde and thin in the way that suggested it was a point of pride rather than circumstance, with a neck that seemed slightly too long for the rest of her and eyes that went immediately to Percy's worn trainers and then to the logo on his Camp Half-Blood shirt, which he really should have changed, but Annabeth had said quickly as well as quietly, and decided something unflattering before he'd said a word. "Yes," she said. "Hi," Percy said. He gave her the smile that Annabeth called his "don't make this difficult" smile, the one that was friendly enough to seem genuine and firm enough to mean it. "I'm looking for something that belongs to me. I think it might be in your house." The woman, and he could see the name on the brass letterbox now, V. Dursley, Petunia probably, she had the look of a petunia, drew herself up. "I don't know what you mean. Whatever it is, it's certainly not, it's under your stairs," Percy said. Her face did something complicated. A flash of something that wasn't quite guilt but lived in the same neighborhood. "The cupboard has junk in it. Old boxes, the Hoover, nothing that belongs to, there's a kid in there," Percy said, and his voice came out very quiet and very flat, because that was the only way he could say it without it turning into something that broke windows. Petunia Dursley opened her mouth. Then she closed it. Then she said, with the specific tone of someone who has rehearsed this, "He's napping. He likes it in there." "He chose, open the door," Percy said. "He wasn't asking." She heard that. From deeper in the house, heavy footsteps. The man who appeared in the hallway behind Petunia was enormous in the way that suggested he'd been large and solid once and had spent a decade converting that into something softer and angrier. Vernon Dursley had a mustache that telegraphed his mood like a weather vane, and right now it was pointing straight into Thunderous. "What's this?" he demanded. "I'm here for what's under your stairs," Percy said. "Both things." Vernon's face went through several colors. "Now look here, boy, I don't know who you think you are, but you can't just turn up at a man's house and make accusations." The sky cracked open. Not with rain. There was no rain. Just sound, a single, massive, chest-compressing boom of thunder from a sky that had been cloudless 30 seconds ago, and then a column of light hit the garden path 6 feet behind Percy with enough force to leave a scorch mark in the concrete, and when the light cleared, Thor was standing in it. Percy turned around. Thor was in civilian clothes, dark jeans, a grey Henley that was doing a lot of structural work, Mjolnir hanging from his belt in its compact form because he'd gotten better about blending in, mostly, and his expression was the one Percy had come to think of as his "something is wrong and I am about to find out what" face. His eyes were scanning the house. His jaw was set. "Jackson," he said. "Hey," Percy said. "You felt it too." "I have been tracking a seer signature for 6 hours," Thor said, and his voice had the particular resonance it got when he was containing something significant. "It led me here." "Yeah," Percy said. "Me too. Different kind of signature." They looked at each other. Then they both looked at the house. Vernon Dursley had gone the color of old putty. "What, who, how did, sir," Thor said, with the precise courtesy of someone who had decided to give a person exactly one opportunity to be reasonable, "there is a child in a cupboard in your home. I would like you to open it. This is private property." Vernon bellowed, finding his footing in indignation the way some people always did. "You have no right to come here," and Percy was already walking past him. The hallway of Number 4 Privet Drive smelled like furniture polish and something cooked and slightly too much floral air freshener, and the door under the stairs was the kind of door that had been painted over so many times it was slightly sticky at the edges. There was a latch on the outside. A lock. Percy looked at the lock for a moment. Then he put his hand flat against the door and felt it, the artifact's pull, warm and oceanic, and underneath it something else, something that felt like the first breath before a storm, like the pressure drop that came before lightning, layered over with magic so old and layered he couldn't have named what flavor it was if he'd tried. He unlatched the door and pulled it open. The cupboard was small and dark and smelled like dust and something slightly damp. There was a cot along one wall, thin and low, with a blanket that had been washed so many times the pattern had disappeared. There was a shelf with a broken toy car and 2 library books with cracked spines. There was a small child sitting cross-legged on the cot with his back against the wall and his knees pulled up to his chest, watching the door open with eyes that were too old and too careful for a face that small. Green eyes. Vivid, extraordinary green, behind round glasses with one arm repaired with a strip of sellotape. Black hair that went in every direction at once. A fading bruise on his left forearm in the approximate shape of a hand. A t-shirt that was 3 sizes too big and trousers that had been rolled up at the ankles 4 times and were still nearly dragging. He looked about 5. He looked like he'd been 5 for a long time, in the particular way of children who have learned that being small was the only protection available to them. He looked at Percy and didn't say anything. Percy crouched down so they were eye level. His throat was doing something inconvenient. "Hey," he said. "What's your name?" The boy looked at him with those measuring eyes. Then he said, in a voice that was small but not afraid, "Harry." "Harry," Percy said. "I'm Percy. That's Thor." He gestured over his shoulder where Thor had appeared silently in the hallway behind him, ducking slightly to avoid the ceiling. "We're not here to hurt you. We're just here to—" He stopped, because the sentence he'd been about to say was return an artifact, and that was clearly not the whole truth anymore. "We're just here," he said instead. Harry looked past Percy at Thor. Thor raised a hand, not a wave exactly, more an acknowledgement, one equal to another. Harry looked back at Percy. "You knocked," he said. "Yeah. Most people don't knock," Harry said, with the gravity of someone stating a fundamental law of the universe. Percy felt something crack open in his chest, quiet and irreparable. "Yeah," he said again, because it was all he had. "I know." From behind them, Vernon Dursley's voice hit them like a thrown bucket. "You get away from him. That boy is our responsibility and you have no right, Petunia, call the police, Mr. Dursley." Thor's voice didn't raise. It didn't need to. It simply became more resonant, more present, like a frequency that the body registered before the ears did. Percy heard Vernon stop moving. "I would ask that you give us a moment. He's our nephew." I know what he is to you," Thor said. There was something in his tone that Percy couldn't quite read, not anger exactly, but something more considered than anger, something that had looked at the situation from all angles and arrived at a conclusion that wasn't good for Vernon Dursley. "I am asking you to step back." A short silence. Percy could hear Vernon breathing, fast and furious. But he stepped back. Percy turned back to Harry, who had watched this whole exchange with the careful attention of someone who had learned to read rooms the way other kids learn to read books. "Can I come in?" Percy asked. Harry looked at the cramped space. Then at Percy. Then he nodded and shifted slightly on the cot, making room, Percy realized, which meant the cot was Harry's idea of sharing rather than a gesture toward the floor, and Percy sat down next to him. The cot creaked alarmingly under Percy's weight but held. "How long have you been in here?" Percy asked. Harry thought about it with a seriousness that suggested this was not a simple question. "Since I was little," he said. "You're still little," Percy said, gently. "Littler, then." Harry pulled at a loose thread on the blanket. "Before I could remember proper." Percy looked at the shelf, the two books, both of them clearly checked out of a public library because they had the plastic protective covers and the barcode stickers, not anything that belonged here. One was about dinosaurs. One was about the ocean. He looked at the ocean book for a moment. "You like the ocean?" he asked. Harry's face did something complicated and very quick, like a door opening and closing. "I've never seen it," he said. "But I dream about it." Percy took a slow breath. "Harry," he said carefully, "do you know why you dream about it?" Harry shook his head. But his eyes were curious in a way that went beyond a 5-year-old's curiosity, that layered, attentive look again, like he'd been filing away questions for years and was waiting to find someone worth asking. "I might be able to help with that," Percy said. "But first I need to ask, and you can say no, okay? You can say no to anything I ask. But I need to ask. Do you want to come with us?" Harry went very still. He looked at Percy. Then he looked at the door, and the hallway beyond it, and the house that was the whole world he'd ever known. Then he looked back at Percy with those green eyes that had seen too much and believed very little and said, very quietly, "Where?" "Somewhere better than this," Percy said. "I promise." Thor appeared in the cupboard doorway. The doorframe was barely wide enough for his shoulders, so he was tilted slightly sideways, which under other circumstances would have been funny. His expression was not funny. It was the expression of a man who had decided something. "We should move," he said to Percy. "There are other presences. Magical. Watching." Percy stood up. "Watching the house. Watching the boy." Harry looked up at Thor with no particular fear on his face, which Percy filed away as either remarkable courage or the result of having had all the normal fear responses trained out of him, neither of which was a comfortable thought. "The cat lady," Harry said. Percy looked at him. What? Mrs. Fig, Harry said. Number 7. She has lots of cats. She watches me when they go out. He said it without inflection, just information. She doesn't smell like cat though. She smells like chalk. Percy and Thor looked at each other over Harry's head. Squib, Percy said, the word surfacing from his encounter with the wizarding world 2 years ago. A non-magical person connected to the magical world. Surveillance, Thor said. Yeah. Percy looked down at Harry. Okay. Let's get your things. Harry held up the ocean book. This isn't mine, he said. It's the library's. We'll return it, Percy said. There's a fine, Harry said, with the look of someone who has worried about library fines before. I'll pay it, Percy said. Come on. They came out of the cupboard to find Vernon and Petunia Dursley standing in the hallway side by side, and from the top of the stairs a large blond boy, Dudley, Percy remembered from the name on the mailbox list Annabeth had compiled, peering down with his thumb in his mouth. Petunia's face was doing something that Percy would later describe to Annabeth as complicated guilt trying very hard to look like righteous indignation. Vernon's face was just indignation. You can't take him, Vernon said. He's our legal responsibility. His parents are dead, Percy said, and it came out harder than he intended but he didn't soften it because it was true and it deserved to be said plainly. They've been dead 4 years. He's been in a cupboard for 4 years. It was his choice, he's 5, Percy said. He doesn't get to choose a cupboard. He looked at Petunia. You knew his parents. Something flickered across Petunia's face. Not guilt, something older and more complicated than guilt. Grief, maybe, thoroughly calcified. My sister, she said, and the word came out like something she hadn't meant to say. Then you know what he is, Percy said. And what he's going to become. And you chose this. He gestured at the cupboard door, still hanging open, the thin cot visible inside. You chose this for your sister's kid. Petunia's jaw tightened. She said nothing. We're leaving, Percy said. You can call whoever you need to call. We'll deal with it. He looked at Vernon. Don't. Vernon seemed to be calculating something, the size of Thor, the certainty in Percy's voice, the fact that the sky outside had developed, in the last 5 minutes, a distinctly threatening quality that hadn't been there before. Lightning flickered somewhere in the middle distance. It wasn't raining yet. It was waiting. Vernon stepped aside. Percy picked Harry up, which Harry allowed with the particular stillness of a child who has learned not to have expectations about being carried, and they walked out of Number 4 Privet Drive into the thick July afternoon. Harry was lighter than Percy had expected and heavier than he should have been, the weird weight of a child who was there, fully, completely present in a way that felt significant. Harry looked over Percy's shoulder at the house as they walked down the path. Not with longing. Just looking, the way you looked at something you were recording rather than missing. Thor, Percy said, when they reached the garden gate. I have a vehicle, Thor said. A vehicle, Percy repeated. He looked at the lightning still flickering in that particular patch of sky overhead. Like a car. Like a car, Thor said, and the smallest thing that wasn't quite a smile crossed his face. I have learned. Annabeth was very clear about the landing situations. They walked 3 streets over, Harry still on Percy's hip, to where a matte black Range Rover was parked with the kind of confidence that suggested it had never worried about a parking ticket in its life. Thor climbed in and the suspension side. Percy got in the back with Harry, who had not said anything since they left the house, who was sitting very straight and very still and looking out the window with those old, careful eyes. Harry, Percy said. You okay? Harry thought about this with genuine seriousness. I don't know, he said. I've never been okay before. I'm not sure what it feels like. Percy opened his mouth. Closed it. Looked at the back of Thor's head, who caught his eye in the rearview mirror, and for a moment neither of them said anything because there was nothing to say that would be sufficient. Then Harry said, in a small voice that was trying very hard not to be hopeful and failing completely, "You said somewhere better." "Yeah," Percy said. "Is it near the ocean?" Percy thought about the pull he'd felt from the boy, oceanic and ancient and completely inexplicable for a 5-year-old raised in suburban Surrey. He thought about the library book with the cracked spine. He thought about what Annabeth was going to say when he called her, and how she was going to say it, and how she was going to be right. "Actually," he said, "yeah. It is." Harry turned from the window and looked at Percy with an expression so carefully contained it broke his heart a little, and then, like someone who decided a risk was worth taking, Harry let a fraction of something through. Something that lived in the neighborhood of hope. His mouth curved up on one side. It wasn't a full smile. It was the beginning of one. Percy decided he was going to make sure Harry Potter got to finish it. Thor drove them to a hotel outside the city while Percy made calls he didn't want Harry to hear, which was an interesting challenge since Harry was clearly a child who noticed everything, so Percy ended up stepping out to the small car park and calling Annabeth while keeping one eye on the hotel room window where Harry's silhouette was visible sitting on the edge of the bed, very straight, watching Thor do something at the desk that appeared to involve a lot of paperwork. "Annabeth," Percy said, when she picked up. "Did you get it?" she said. "The artifact?" Percy said. "Define it." A pause. "Percy. The artifact is a kid," Percy said. "The artifact is a 5-year-old boy who dreams about the ocean and lived in a cupboard, and he's got a demigod signature but also something else, something really old, and Thor showed up at the same time I did because he was following a seer signature, Annabeth, and they're both coming from the same source." The silence on the other end was the specific silence of Annabeth processing something too large for an immediate response. "Say that again," she said. "The kid is the artifact," Percy said. "Or he has it. Or he is it. I don't know. He's 5, he's named Harry, he's got the most intense eyes I've ever seen, and Thor is currently doing paperwork, which tells you how serious this is." "Percy," Annabeth said, very carefully, "are you telling me you have a child?" "I'm telling you we found a child who needed not being in a cupboard," Percy said, "and I made a promise, so yes." "Temporarily. We have a child. Temporarily." Another silence. "Is Thor?" "He seemed just as surprised as me," Percy said. "But he didn't leave. He's doing paperwork, Annabeth." "Okay," she said, slowly. "Okay. I'm coming. Don't do anything until I get there." "I'm not doing anything." "Percy. Don't do anything." "I already kind of did the main thing," Percy said, "but I'll hold off on the secondary things." "Sure." He hung up and looked at the hotel window. Harry had moved, he was on the bed properly now, cross-legged, and Thor had moved his chair around to face him and was talking. Not in the careful, slightly forced way adults usually talk to very small children. In the way you talk to someone you were just talking to, gesturing occasionally, and Harry was listening with his whole body, that total attentiveness that seemed to be his default mode, head slightly tilted. Percy went back inside. "Storms on Earth are nothing," Thor was saying, to the storms on Asgard. "My mother called them breath storms. She said the sky was breathing." "Is your mother very tall?" Harry asked. "She is," Thor said. "Is she nice?" Thor considered this the way he considered most things, seriously, without rushing to a comfortable answer. "She is the kindest person I have ever known," he said, "which is different from nice, I think." Harry thought about this. "Different how?" "Kind means you choose to be good," Thor said. "Nice sometimes just means you do not want trouble." Harry was quiet for a moment. "Mrs. Fig is nice," he said. "She gives me biscuits when they leave me there. But she always looked at me like," he stopped. Started again. "Like she was waiting for something to happen to me." Thor looked at Percy over Harry's head. Percy gave a fractional nod. "Harry," Thor said, "are you hungry?" Harry blinked, as though the question was unexpected. "A bit," he said, in the tone of someone who had learned that admitting to hunger had unpredictable results. "A bit," Percy repeated, in a tone that meant considerably more than a bit. He picked up the hotel room service menu. "What do you want?" Harry looked at the menu with the expression of someone who had never been given a menu before and was trying to calibrate how much wanting was acceptable. "The pasta," he said, pointing at a bolognese. Is that too expensive?" "It is not too expensive," Thor said, with absolute certainty. "Can I have it?" Harry asked, and it was the simplest question Percy had ever heard, and it was also somehow the saddest. "Yeah," Percy said, very casually, because Harry didn't need to see how much that question had landed. "You can have whatever you want." He ordered the pasta. He also ordered enough other food to cover the table because he knew from experience that children who had been hungry for a long time needed to see abundance before they could relax enough to actually eat, and watching Harry's shoulders drop about 2 inches when the trolley arrived confirmed this. Harry ate the pasta methodically and with great focus, and then looked at the remaining dishes on the table with a calculating expression. "You can have more," Percy said. "I'm not being greedy." "Eating when you're hungry isn't greedy," Percy said. "Eating when you're hungry is just eating." Harry had more pasta. Then some of the bread. Then, with the gravity of a diplomat accepting a peace offering, a slice of the chocolate cake Percy had ordered with specifically this moment in mind. He ate the cake and then sat back against the headboard, and his expression, which had been operating at controlled and careful all evening, shifted for just a moment into something unguarded. Satisfied, maybe. Present. "Percy," he said. "Yeah." "Why did the sea pull me?" he said. "When you talked about it. It felt like," he put a hand on his sternum, pressing lightly. "Here." Percy looked at him. At those eyes, which in the warm hotel room light had turned the specific shade of green that happened when sunlight came through shallow ocean water. At the hair, which had settled into something that looked less chaotic now and more like it was just doing what it wanted. "Thank you very much. I think," Percy said carefully, "that you have some of the same heritage I do. I think some of the same things are in your blood." "What things?" "The ocean," Percy said. "The sea. My father is Poseidon." Harry stared at him. "The god?" "Yeah. The sea god. That's the one." Harry processed this with remarkable composure. "And my parents, I don't know all of it yet," Percy said honestly. "I know something's there. I know it's real. I know the ocean knew you before you knew it." He paused. "We're going to figure it out. All of it. I promise." Harry looked at him steadily. Evaluating, in that way he had, like he was running some internal calculation about the reliability of promises. Then he nodded, once, with the gravity of a business agreement. "Okay," he said. Thor, from his chair, made a sound that Percy, if pressed, would have described as a quietly satisfied exhale. Like something had clicked into place. Outside, the threatening Surrey sky finally made up its mind. Rain came down, steady and cleansing, against the hotel windows. The thunder that accompanied it was gentle compared to what Thor could do, just the natural kind, the sky doing its weather, but Harry turned toward the window when he heard it, and his face went to that open, unguarded look again, eyes wide, watching the lightning flicker. "I like storms," he said, quietly, like it was a confession. "Yeah," Percy said. "I wonder why." Harry looked at him sharply, not offended, just caught. And then he smiled. A proper one this time, the full version, sudden and bright and completely transformative. It looked like exactly what it was, the beginning of something that couldn't be put back. From outside the window, in the wet grey Surrey evening, a cat sat on the garden wall of number 7, watching the hotel 3 blocks over with eyes that were slightly too intelligent for a cat, and then turned and walked purposefully back toward the house to find a telephone. 3 time zones west, Annabeth Chase was already on a plane. And somewhere considerably further than 3 time zones, in a place that existed sideways from the regular world, in a hall with a ceiling lost in shadows and a throne that had been empty for several centuries of careful management, a figure with a horned helmet and very green eyes of his own paused in the middle of a sentence he'd been addressing to no one in particular, tilted his head, and said, to the air, "Well. That changes things." He smiled, slow and considering, and it was not a comfortable smile, though it was a genuinely interested one. "Let's see what you do with that," Loki said softly, to a boy 3 countries away who couldn't hear him yet. The storm outside Number 4 Privet Drive continued for the rest of the night, thorough and unhurried, as if it had decided to stick around now that it had somewhere to be. Chapter 2, What the Ocean Remembers. The Scottish coast hit Harry like a physical thing. They'd driven through the night, Percy and Thor taking turns at the wheel while Harry slept in the back seat with his head against the window and his breath fogging the glass in small, regular clouds, and somewhere around 4 in the morning Percy had stopped at a service station and bought a packet of crisps and a bottle of water and stood outside in the car park looking at the motorway lights and called Annabeth again. "He's asleep," he said, when she picked up. "Good," she said. She was on a connecting flight, her voice slightly compressed by altitude. "Percy. I've been thinking. Dangerous. The signature you felt. The oceanic pull. I've been going through everything I know about mixed heritage cases and there's a theory, really old, that Poseidon's lineage doesn't just pass through demigod children. It can skip generations. Go dormant. Surface in a bloodline centuries later if the right circumstances." Annabeth. "What?" "He's 5, Percy said. He had 2 books in his cupboard and one of them was about the ocean. We can do the theory stuff but can we also just, he's 5. A pause. "I know," she said, and her voice shifted into something softer. "I know. I'm sorry. How is he?" Percy looked at the car. Through the window he could see Harry's silhouette, the curve of his shoulder, the faint shape of the glasses he'd kept on even sleeping. He asked if the pasta was too expensive, Percy said. Annabeth was quiet for a moment. "Okay," she said. "We'll figure it out." "Yeah. Don't take him to the ocean until I get there." Percy had already been thinking about the beach. The pull he'd felt from Harry wasn't diminishing, if anything it was stronger now that they were moving, now that Harry was out of Surrey and the suppressive weight of whatever magic had been sitting on that house. "Why not?" "Because I want to see what happens," Annabeth said, "and I want to be there when it does. Wait for me." Percy had agreed and meant it, and they'd kept driving north, and now it was 10 in the morning and they were parked on a headland above a beach on the Northumberland coast that Percy had found on the map because it was remote enough to be empty at this hour and close enough to a small village that they could get coffee, which Thor needed, and breakfast, which Harry needed, and a moment to think, which Percy desperately needed. Harry had woken up when the engine stopped and looked out the window at the sea. And everything about him had changed. Not dramatically. He didn't gasp or shout. He just, stilled. Went completely, profoundly still in a way that was different from all his other kinds of stillness. His other silences were controlled, watchful, calibrated. This one was the opposite. This was the stillness of something that has stopped bracing itself. "That's it," Harry said. Not a question. A recognition. "Yeah," Percy said, from the front seat. Harry pressed his hand flat against the window glass, the same way he'd pressed it against the cupboard vent, except this time the thing on the other side was infinite and grey-green and loud with wind. Then he turned to Percy with an expression so raw and immediate that Percy looked away to give him a moment with it. "Can I go down?" Harry asked. "After breakfast," Percy said. "I promised Annabeth we'd wait." Harry accepted this with equanimity and returned to looking at the ocean through the glass, and Percy noticed that he'd left his hand on the window. Just resting there. Like keeping contact. They found a cafe in the village below the headland, small, warm, steaming with the smell of bacon and toast, and the woman behind the counter gave Harry a look that lingered about 2 seconds too long. The kind of look that registered this child is too thin and where are his parents, and then looked at Percy and Thor and arrived at some conclusion that was clearly these are not his parents but they are with him, and settled into a watchful kind of welcome. Her name was Janet, based on the tag, and she gave Harry extra toast without being asked and didn't comment on the way he ate it, and Percy made a note to leave a very good tip. Harry ate systematically and completely and then looked up. Annabeth, he said. That's a Greek name. Percy looked at him. Yeah. How do you know that? The library books, Harry said. I read a book about Greek myths. The gods. He paused. Annabeth was Athena's city. Close, Percy said. Athens was Athena's city. Annabeth is a person. She's he paused, trying to land on the right word and finding that all of them were simultaneously accurate and insufficient. She's my person, he said. Harry considered this. Is she nice or kind? Percy thought about Annabeth, her precision and her loyalty and her absolute refusal to let him be less than he could be, and the way she'd said I know last night on the phone and meant it down to the marrow. Both, he said. But more kind. Harry nodded like this confirmed something. Thor, who had been working through a plate of eggs and what appeared to be half a loaf of toast, set down his fork and looked at Harry. May I ask you something? Harry nodded. The storms, Thor said. You said you liked them. Have you always? Harry thought about it. There was a storm when I was very little, he said. I was in the cupboard. A really big one. And I wasn't scared. He looked at his toast. Uncle Vernon was scared. I could hear him. But I wasn't. He said it without pride, just as a fact. It felt like something talking to me. Thor absorbed this. His expression was doing something complex that Percy had come to recognize as Thor in the process of connecting things he hadn't expected to connect. What does it feel like now? Thor asked, tilting his head toward the window and the sea visible beyond the village rooftops. With the ocean close? Harry didn't answer immediately. He picked up his orange juice. He'd been drinking it slowly, like he was savoring it, like he'd never had orange juice before, which was possible and which Percy was choosing not to think about right now, and looked into it. Like the storms, he said finally. But slower. The storms feel like questions. The ocean feels like answers. Percy and Thor looked at each other. That, Percy said, is honestly the most accurate description of the difference between sea and storm that I've ever heard. Yes, Thor agreed, quietly. Harry looked between them. Is that important? Very, Thor said. Why? Because, Percy said, storms usually belong to one kind of power and oceans to another. And you just said they feel like the same thing. He watched Harry's face, the careful processing happening behind those eyes. That's unusual. Am I unusual? Harry said, and the question was completely neutral, completely honest, the question of someone who had been told he was unusual as a punishment for his entire life and was now wondering if it meant something different. Yeah, Percy said. In a really good way. Harry put his orange juice down and looked at the window again. I'd like to go to the beach, he said, when Annabeth comes. Soon, Percy promised. Annabeth arrived at 11:15 in a hire car that she'd collected from Edinburgh Airport, which Percy had not arranged, and she had apparently arranged herself from the plane because she was Annabeth and logistics were a love language. She pulled up next to the Range Rover on the headland and got out, and the wind off the sea immediately did something chaotic to her hair, which she ignored in the focused way she ignored everything that wasn't the primary objective. The primary objective, apparently, was Harry. She crouched down in front of him. He'd come outside when he'd seen the hire car, standing a careful 6 feet back as new people were still a calibration exercise, and looked at him with her gray eyes that didn't miss things, and said, "Hi. I'm Annabeth. You must be Harry." Harry looked at her. "Your eyes are like a storm," he said. Annabeth blinked. Then, to Percy's private delight, she actually smiled, the full one, the rare one, not the polite version she deployed for situations that required it. "That might be the nicest thing anyone said to me," she said. "Are you kind or nice?" Harry asked. She glanced at Percy. Percy spread his hands. "Don't look at me." She looked back at Harry. "I'm told I'm both," she said. "Depending on the situation." "Percy says you're kind," Harry said. "Percy's right about more things than he lets on," Annabeth said, and got up and looked at Percy over Harry's head and said, quietly but clearly, "We're going to the beach." The path down to the beach was steep and slightly treacherous, cut into the cliff face by years of boots, the kind of path that required attention to your footing. Percy went ahead and Harry came after him, and Annabeth and Thor came behind, and halfway down Harry slipped on a wet rock and Percy caught his arm without thinking, and Harry grabbed Percy's hand and didn't let go for the rest of the descent. He still hadn't let go when they reached the sand. The beach was a long gray crescent, empty except for seabirds and the wind, the kind of beach that felt like it was at the end of the world and had made peace with that. The sea was rough, white-capped, loud, constantly moving, green-gray under the overcast sky. The smell was salt and cold and something ancient underneath. Harry stopped at the edge of the sand where the path ended. He stood very still. The ocean was loud. The wind was loud. But Percy, standing just behind him, felt the moment something shifted in the quality of the air around Harry, a pressure change, subtle, like the drop before a storm, except nothing was storming, the sky was just gray and wild, and it wasn't coming from above. It was coming from Harry. "Go on," Percy said, very quietly. Harry took his shoes off. He looked at Percy, checking, and Percy nodded, and then Harry walked forward across the cold sand toward the water, and the water did something. Not dramatically. Not like the sea parting or waves rearing up or any of the theatrical things Percy had seen Poseidon do when he was making a point. It was subtler than that and more fundamental. The nearest wave, which had been rolling in at the same pace and angle as all the other waves, slowed. Not stopped, slowed, and curved, and came in differently, coming around to the sides rather than straight on, like an animal adjusting its approach to something it recognized. Harry walked into the surf up to his ankles. The cold didn't seem to register. He stood there with the foam breaking around his feet and his shoes in his hand and his oversized trousers getting wet at the rolled-up hems, and he looked out at the horizon, and Percy could see his profile from where he stood, the set of his jaw, the openness of his expression, the absolute absence of the guardedness he'd been carrying since the cupboard. Then Harry crouched down and put his hand in the water. The ocean lit up. That was the only way Percy could describe it, not light exactly, but a quality of attention, like a vast something turning toward them, like the deep ocean looking up. He felt it in his own chest, the pull of his father's domain responding to something it recognized, and it wasn't responding to Percy. Percy was just in the vicinity. The response was completely, utterly, entirely directed at the small boy with his hand in the water. "Oh," Annabeth said, from beside Percy, very quietly. "Yeah," Percy said. Thor said nothing. He was standing slightly apart, and Percy looked at him and found him watching with an expression that wasn't surprise, it was the expression of someone watching a confirmation rather than a revelation. Like he'd known, coming in from Asgard on that lightning strike, following that seer signature, that this was what he was going to find. Harry pulled his hand out of the water and looked at it. The water didn't fall off. It stayed on his palm in a perfect sphere, hovering, and Harry stared at it with enormous eyes behind the repaired glasses. "What?" he said. Not frightened. Just completely present in the question. "That's you doing that," Percy said, walking down to him. "That's your power." Harry looked up at him. "I have power." Percy crouched beside him. The water sphere was still sitting on Harry's palm, wobbling slightly with his breathing. Percy reached out and put his finger under it and it moved to him, obedient as a pet. "Yeah," he said. "You do." He sent it back to Harry's palm. "Feel how you're holding it." Harry went very focused, that total attention he brought to everything. "It's like squeezing," he said, "but without my hand. Here." He touched his sternum again, "Same spot as last night." "That's exactly what it is," Percy said. "That's how you'll always feel it. Hold it there." Harry held it. The sphere rotated slowly. He watched it with an expression of absolute concentration and something that was rapidly becoming joy, not the careful, provisional kind he'd shown last night, but the full kind, the kind that didn't know yet to protect itself. "Can I make it bigger?" he asked. "Try," Percy said. Harry looked at the sphere and the water sphere grew. Not fast, it expanded steadily, pulling water from the sea with a whisper of sound, going from a golf ball to a football to something substantial, a rotating globe of seawater that caught the grey light and refracted it in all directions, and Harry was laughing, a genuine, delighted laugh, the laugh of someone who had found something they didn't know they'd lost. Annabeth made a sound. Percy looked at her. She was watching with her grey eyes very bright and her hand over her mouth, and he understood because he felt it too, a kind of resonant gladness that was almost painful. Harry let the water go and it fell back into the sea with a splash that soaked all of them, and he immediately looked guilty. "Sorry, don't apologize for your power," Percy said, wiping his face. "Not ever." "Okay." Harry looked at him. "Okay," he said, in a tone that suggested this was going to require practice. "Again," Percy said. "Smaller this time. And move it." Harry moved it. He moved it in a spiral, then a figure eight, then a flat disc that he spun above their heads like a shield, his face utterly absorbed in the geometry of it, the physics of water responding to his will, and Percy watched with the quiet satisfaction of someone who has seen this exact moment before, the moment a demigod figures out what they are, and never stopped finding it remarkable. Thor walked down to the water's edge and stood slightly to Harry's right, watching. The sky above them had been thickening while Harry practiced, the grey pressing lower, and Percy noticed it the same way he noticed weather when it was building towards something intentional rather than meteorological. He looked at Thor. Thor was very still. His eyes were closed. The sky answered. Not with lightning, with pressure, with presence, the specific quality of the air before Mjolnir moved through it, and when Percy looked at Harry he saw that Harry had noticed too and was looking at Thor with the same attentiveness he'd had looking at the ocean, head tilted, something in him leaning toward it the way a needle leaned toward north. "Harry," Thor said, without opening his eyes. "Can you feel that?" "Yes," Harry said immediately. "What does it feel like?" Harry put his hand back to his chest, but this time higher, not the sternum where the ocean lived but the solar plexus, the diaphragm, the place where breath and instinct met. "Different," he said. "The ocean is outside me. Like it's calling to me. This is inside. Like it was already there." Thor opened his eyes. "Yes," he said, and it was a word doing a great deal of work. "What is it?" Harry asked. "Something very old," Thor said. "Something in your mother's blood." He looked at Percy. "The Vanir. Her line connects to the Old Norse magic. I suspected when I felt the signature. I am now certain." Harry was watching Thor with those eyes that had been taking in information since they'd opened that morning. "What does that mean?" he said. "For me. It means," Thor said, carefully and honestly, "that you are both things. Ocean and storm. Sea and lightning." He paused. "It means you are something that has not quite existed before." Harry absorbed this. Then he looked at the water sphere still spinning in front of him. He'd kept it going this whole time, Percy realized, maintaining it without thinking the way Percy sometimes kept water moving without realizing he was doing it, and he looked at the sky, and something in his face went very quiet and very determined. "Show me," he said to Thor. "The storm part." Thor looked at him. Then, with the slight curve of the mouth that Percy was beginning to understand was Thor's version of a grin, he raised his hand toward the sky. The cloud response was immediate, not the waiting, threatened kind of storm that Surrey had been doing all yesterday, but a real one, fast and purposeful, the sky organizing itself around a center point directly above the beach. Thunder rolled across the water, bass and resonant, and the first crack of lightning hit the sea 100 meters out with a sound like the world splitting, and Harry did not flinch. He looked up at it with his whole face open and said, "Yes." Just that. Yes. Like agreeing with something. And the lightning that came down the next time came to the beach. To Harry. Percy's whole body went for his weapon on instinct. Riptide was out and open in a fraction of a second, and then he stopped, because the lightning wasn't hitting Harry. It was landing around him, a ring of strikes in the wet sand, illuminating him at the center, and Harry was standing in the middle of it with his arms slightly out and his face turned up to the rain that had finally come down, and he was completely unharmed, and he was laughing again, the same full delighted laugh, and his eyes, behind the rain-spotted glasses, were doing something Percy had never seen eyes do. They were lit up from inside, just for a moment, vivid green shot through with gold, the specific gold of lightning, the specific green of the deep sea, and then it passed and they were just Harry's eyes again. "Okay," Annabeth said, from several meters back, in a tone that meant she was recalibrating everything she'd previously thought she knew. "Okay. We need to talk about this." "We do," Percy agreed. "Later." "No, I mean, Annabeth. Look at him." She looked at Harry, who had sat down in the wet sand with the lightning ring fading around him and the rain coming down properly now, soaking him completely, with no coat and no concern, examining a piece of sea glass he'd found with the same focus he brought to everything. Her expression did what Percy's had done in the hotel room last night. It cracked open slightly, just at the edges, and then reset. "Later," she agreed. Thor walked down and sat in the wet sand next to Harry without any apparent concern for his jeans, and Harry held up the sea glass, clouded pale blue, small, worn smooth by years, and Thor looked at it and said, "In Asgard, there is glass on the shore of the Bifrost Landing that looks exactly like that. The light does something to it." "What does it look like?" Harry asked. "Blue," Thor said, "but alive. Like the color is moving." "That sounds better than this one," Harry said. "I could show you," Thor said, and said it so simply and straightforwardly, as just an available option, that Percy watched Harry process the offer without any of the flinching that came with hopes that had been disappointed. He was offering it the way you offer to show someone a thing because they'd like it, not as a reward or a bait. Harry looked at him. "Really?" "Really," Thor said. Harry turned the sea glass over in his fingers. "Could Percy come?" "Of course," Thor said. Harry looked at the glass. "And Annabeth?" "If she wishes," Thor said. Harry looked up at him. "Okay," he said, in the same tone he'd used last night, the business agreement tone, the one that meant he'd decided something was real. "I'd like that." Percy sat down on Harry's other side. 3 of them in a row in the wet sand, the rain coming down, the waves coming in. After a moment Annabeth sighed loudly from behind them, said something in ancient Greek that Percy knew was a complaint about rational behavior and weather, and came and sat down next to Percy. Harry leaned very slightly, barely perceptibly, against Percy's shoulder. Percy didn't say anything. He just let it happen. They sat on the beach in the rain for a long time, and nobody talked, and the sea came in and went out, and the storm that Thor had called moved along the coast toward the south, unhurried, the sky unwinding itself around them. It was Annabeth who finally broke the quiet. "Harry," she said. "I need to ask you some things. About your parents." Harry was quiet for a moment. "I don't know much," he said. "They said my father crashed his car. Because he was drunk." He said it flatly, fact style. "And my mother died in it too." Annabeth and Percy and Thor were all very still. "That's not what happened," Percy said. Harry looked at him. "Your parents were magical," Percy said. "What you've been feeling, what happened with the water, what happened with the lightning, that's from them. It didn't come from nowhere." Harry was very quiet. The sea glass was in his palm and he was looking at it. "I'm not normal," he said. "No," Percy said. "You're not. But normal was never going to be an option for you, and that's, Harry, that's not a bad thing. That's the actual best thing." Harry looked up at him from under the wet hair that had plastered itself across his forehead in a way that emphasized an odd mark, a scar, Percy registered, thin and pale, following a jagged line. He'd noticed it last night but not thought much of it. Now, with everything he knew about Harry's heritage and the thing that lived behind the signature pull of the artifact, he looked at it more carefully. It wasn't just a scar. There was something in it, a resonance, faint but present, like a frequency that didn't quite belong to Harry. Foreign. Embedded. Percy felt it the same way he'd felt the pull of the artifact, except this wasn't the pull of the sea or the pressure of a storm. This was something else. Something cold and purposeful, sitting in a scar on a 5-year-old's forehead like a splinter. He didn't say anything about it yet. Not now, not on this beach, not while Harry was sitting in the rain discovering what joy felt like. But he caught Annabeth's eye and saw from her expression that she'd seen it too, and filed it the way she filed things that required thought before speech. Later, then. "Your mother's name was Lily," Percy said, and even though he had no right to know this with certainty he felt sure of it the way he felt sure of ocean things. And she was extraordinary. Whatever else was or wasn't true about them, that was true. Harry's throat moved. He looked at the sea glass. "How do you know?" Percy looked at the ocean and thought about bloodlines and legacies and the things that got passed down through generations like coded messages. He thought about a 5-year-old dreaming about the ocean from a cupboard in Surrey. He thought about lightning that came to Harry rather than hitting him. "Because," Percy said, "you're here. And you're this." Harry looked at the water. A wave came in and touched his bare feet and retreated again, gentle, deliberate, the ocean saying something in the only language it had. "Okay," Harry said, for the third time. But this time the word was different, not an agreement, not a business conclusion. It was something more like a beginning. Behind them, on the headland above the beach where the hire car and the Range Rover were parked, Mrs. Arabella Figg's report to the magical world had been received, processed, and passed up 2 levels, and in an office with a great many spinning silver devices and one very exhausted Minerva McGonagall, a man with half-moon spectacles and a silver beard read it twice, set it down, and looked out the window at the grey Scottish sky. Albus Dumbledore was not a man given to panic. He was, however, given to calculation, and the calculation he was currently running had several variables he hadn't anticipated and a conclusion that troubled him deeply. The blood protection was intact, he could feel it, the old magic still humming, tied to Petunia Dursley and to Number 4 in the specific way he'd woven it. Intact, but stretched. Like a thread pulled too far. Like Harry was moving away from it. "Minerva," he said, calmly. McGonagall straightened. "Albus. Find him," he said. "Discreetly, please." He picked up the report again. "And find out what a Norse god is doing in Northumberland." McGonagall's face did something complicated. "You knew this was a risk when you placed him there." "I placed him there for his protection," Dumbledore said, in the patient tone that he knew McGonagall found its most irritating. "Everything I have done has been for his protection." "Albus," she said, and her voice had an edge she didn't usually allow herself. The boy was in a cupboard. A silence stretched between them, long and uncomfortable. "I know," Dumbledore said, and for a moment something crossed his face that was not calculation and not patience, something old and tired and briefly unguarded. "I know." Then it was gone, replaced by the familiar careful authority. "Find him, Minerva. That's all." McGonagall left. Dumbledore sat for a long moment looking at the spinning devices, one of which was connected to Harry, had always been connected to Harry, monitoring the thing Dumbledore knew was in that scar, the terrible thing he'd left there because he'd calculated the cost and paid it in someone else's currency. The device was spinning faster than it should. Harry was being woken up. Dumbledore took off his glasses and pressed his fingers to his eyes, very briefly, and then he put them back on and he was himself again, certain and decided and moving toward the future he'd built at the cost he'd calculated. "Not yet," he said, to no one, or to Harry, or to the spinning device that tracked a life like a clockwork heart. "Not yet, my boy." The device kept spinning. Down on the beach in Northumberland, Harry was standing in the surf with his hand out and the rain coming down, and Percy was teaching him to feel the difference between the pull in his chest and the pressure in his bones, between the sea self and the storm self, and Harry was listening with everything he had, as he always did, which was, it was becoming clear, quite a lot. And Annabeth sat on a rock behind them with a waterproof notebook she'd produced from her coat and was beginning, in her precise architectural hand, to map everything she knew about mixed demigod and Vanir bloodlines. It wasn't much, yet. It would be considerably more by morning. And above the beach, on the headland, a grey tabby cat with spectacle markings around its eyes had appeared at the top of the cliff path, and it sat there in the rain and looked down at the figures on the beach, at the three adults and the small boy who was laughing as a controlled jet of seawater traced a perfect circle in the air above him, and its yellow eyes held something that was not a cat's usual opaque animal stillness. McGonagall looked at the boy for a long time. Then she looked at the sky, which was doing something no natural sky would do, threading light through clouds in a pattern that Scots who were old enough and paid attention might have called God weather, the kind of sky that meant something was happening that mattered. Then she looked at the boy again. She stayed until Percy and Harry came up the beach path toward the cars, and she saw it then, up close, only for a moment, the way Harry walked, the way he held himself, which was nothing like the small contracted shape she'd watched on the Dursleys' doorstep all those years ago. He walked like someone who had just been handed a large and important thing and was still figuring out how to carry it, which was different from the walk of someone who had been told all their life that they were small. She thought about Albus and his spinning devices and his calculations. She thought about a cupboard under the stairs. She thought about Lily Potter's eyes, vivid green, which she could see right now in the face of a very wet 5-year-old who was telling Percy something about sea glass with complete earnestness. The grey cat turned and walked back the way it had come. It did not go immediately home. It sat for a while on the headland in the rain, thinking, and the Scottish sky came down around it, grey and alive, and the ocean said what oceans always said, which was keep going and remember and you were always more than what they told you. Chapter 3, Architecture of Impossible Things. The safe house was a converted lighthouse. Annabeth had found it, of course she had, through a network of properties held in trust by the children of Athena going back several generations, a series of safe harbors scattered along coastlines where demigods could stop and breathe and not be something for a while. This one sat on a rocky promontory on the Caithness coast, the northernmost edge of Scotland, where the land ran out of ideas and handed everything over to the sea. The lighthouse itself hadn't functioned in 40 years. The cottage attached to it had been added in the 1950s by an Athena child named Margaret who'd wanted good walls and a good kitchen and had apparently achieved both. They arrived at dusk, the Range Rover and the hire car nose to tail down a track that was more suggestion than road, and Harry climbed out and looked at the lighthouse, the white tower rising against a sky going orange and violet at the edges, and said, "We're staying here. For now," Annabeth said. "It's brilliant," Harry said, with complete conviction, and went immediately toward the tower door, which was locked, and pressed both hands against it, and the lock did not open but the door trembled slightly on its hinges in a way that had nothing to do with the wind. Percy caught Thor's eye. "Not yet," Percy called to Harry. "Tower structurally uncertain. Annabeth will check it first." Harry turned around. "Can I climb the outside?" "Absolutely not," Percy said. At the same moment Thor said, "Perhaps tomorrow," and Harry looked between them and chose to interpret the combined answer as a provisional yes and went to inspect the rocks instead. The cottage was warm and solid and smelled like old stone and slightly like the sea, which for Harry, Percy was learning, was apparently the smell equivalent of coming home. He'd been like this since the beach, more present, more there, like the ocean had turned the volume knob up inside him. He talked more. He asked questions. Not the careful, minimalist questions of yesterday, the ones designed to take up as little space as possible, but the full sprawling kind, the kind that led immediately to other questions, the kind that 5-year-olds were supposed to ask. He asked Percy why seawater was salty, and when Percy told him it was because of minerals washing in from land over millions of years, Harry asked if that meant the sea was basically very old rain, and Percy said he'd never thought about it that way before, and Harry looked pleased. He asked Thor how Mjolnir knew who was worthy, and when Thor said it was complicated, Harry asked if things that were complicated were usually just things that people hadn't explained properly yet, and Thor said, after a moment, often, yes, with the expression of someone who just had something returned to them that they'd lost. He asked Annabeth what she was drawing in her notebook, and she showed him, the genealogical map she'd been working on, lines and names and connections branching outward from Harry at the center, and Harry sat next to her and looked at it with tremendous seriousness and said, "Is this me?" And Annabeth said, "This is what we know about you so far," and Harry said, "So far," in the tone of someone who found this extremely satisfying. They ate dinner around the kitchen table, pasta again, because it was what was in the cupboard, and because Harry had demonstrated yesterday that he was specifically attached to it, and because nobody was going to override that, and the conversation moved the way conversations moved when people were figuring each other out, fast in some places and slow in others, full of small tests and adjustments. "Your camp," Harry said, to Percy, over his plate. "Camp Half-Blood. Is it far?" "New York," Percy said. "Long Island." Harry absorbed this. "Is it like school?" "Sort of. More swords." "I'd like to learn swords," Harry said, with a directness that made Annabeth smile. "We'll add it to the list," Percy said. "After water control." After we understand what we're working with," Annabeth finished, in the tone that meant she was the one who made the actual training schedules and Percy was the one who turned up to them. "What are we working with?" Harry asked. "We're still figuring that out," Annabeth said. "Which is why I want to test a few things tomorrow. Is that okay with you?" Harry looked at her carefully. He did this, Percy had noticed, with all of them but especially Annabeth, like he was taking measurements. "What kind of tests?" "The kind where you just do things and I watch and take notes," she said. "No wrong answers. Nothing you can fail." Harry considered this. "Like an experiment." "Exactly like an experiment." "I like experiments," Harry said. "In the library there were books about science. I liked the ones about electricity." Percy started to say something, looked at Thor, looked at Harry, and decided not to say what he'd been about to say because it would come out too much like "that explains a lot" and he wasn't sure Harry needed to hear the comedy version of his own heritage right now. After dinner Harry fell asleep on the cottage sofa while Annabeth was talking about genealogical records, which Percy observed with some relief. Harry had been awake since dawn, had been woken up by the ocean and then by lightning, and needed to be unconscious in a warm safe place more than he needed to know anything else tonight. Percy carried him to the small bedroom at the end of the hall and found an extra blanket in the wardrobe and covered him, and stood in the doorway for a moment watching the slow rise and fall of Harry's breathing. The glasses were on the nightstand. Without them Harry looked even smaller and more 5, the scar on his forehead very clear in the low light, and Percy looked at it and the coldness he'd felt on the beach came back, that foreign resonance, that splinter. He closed the door quietly and went back to the kitchen where Annabeth and Thor were waiting. "The scar," Percy said, sitting down. "Yes," Annabeth said. She had the notebook open in front of her, and she'd circled something near the bottom of the genealogical map in red. "I felt it on the beach." "It's not his." "What is it?" Percy asked. Annabeth looked at Thor. Thor was quiet for a moment. "In my experience," he said, "when foreign magic is embedded in a living person, it is one of 3 things. A tracker. A binding. Or a fragment." He looked at the closed bedroom door. "The signature does not feel like a tracker. It is too settled. Too deep." "A binding or a fragment," Annabeth said. "Which is worse?" Percy asked. "Neither is acceptable," Thor said flatly. Agreed, Percy said. But we need to know what we're dealing with before we touch it. Something that deep, that settled, you can't just pull it out. No, Annabeth agreed. She tapped the red circle on the map. I've been looking at the Vanir connection. The seer magic in his mother's line, it's old enough that it would have interacted with anything introduced to him at a very young age. Adapted. It wouldn't just sit there inertly. It would have started growing around it. Like a tree growing around a nail. Percy looked at the notebook. So the Vanir magic is literally protecting him from whatever it is. Not just protecting, Annabeth said. Neutralizing. Slowly. Which might be why she paused, arranging her thought. He's more functional than he should be. A child who's had something like that in their head since before they could walk, you'd expect developmental impacts. Trauma responses, yes, and he has those, but his cognition is extraordinary. His control over the water today was remarkable for a first manifestation, Percy. That shouldn't be possible without practice. The sea magic is compensating, Percy said. It's compensating and the Vanir magic is isolating, Annabeth said. He's essentially been running 3 systems simultaneously since infancy and doing it on his own, with no framework, no training, and no one who knew. Thor reached forward and turned the notebook so he could look at the genealogical map. He studied it for a moment. I would like to bring Frigga into this, he said. Percy looked at him. Your mother. She knows Seer better than anyone, Thor said. If there is Vanir blood in Harry's line, she will recognize it. And she will know what is in the scar. Can you get a message to her without, I don't know, making it a whole Asgardian diplomatic thing? Percy said. Because I feel like we're already managing a lot of fronts and adding Odin to the list before we have more information seems like, I am not bringing Odin, Thor said, with a particular emphasis that suggested Odin's involvement was something he was actively managing. I am bringing my mother. There is a difference. How big a difference? Significant, Thor said, and left it there, which Percy understood to mean, bigger than I want to quantify right now. Okay, Percy said. Tomorrow. After Annabeth's tests. He looked at the closed bedroom door again. He's going to have questions. When he wakes up he's going to want to know about the scar. Let him ask, Annabeth said. We answer what we know. We don't pretend we know things we don't. He'll be able to tell if we do, Percy said, and the certainty in his voice surprised him slightly. But it was true. He'd spent less than 24 hours with this kid and he already knew that Harry's superpower, separate from all the water and lightning business, was the ability to identify a dishonest answer the moment it arrived. He's been lied to his whole life. He knows the shape of it. A short quiet fell over the kitchen. The lighthouse had a particular silence, not empty, but full, the sound of the ocean around it on 3 sides, the wind doing things in the eaves, the ancient stone doing what ancient stone did which was simply endure. Percy, Annabeth said, in the quiet. I know, Percy said. We need to talk about what happens after, she said. Not tonight. But soon. Where he goes. What his life looks like. We can't just, I know, Percy said again. He can't come to camp, she said, gently. He's too young and there are too many factors in play that camp isn't equipped for. The Vanir magic alone would, I know, Annabeth. So what are we doing? Percy looked at his hands. Thought about the beach and the laughing and Harry leaning against his shoulder in the wet sand. Thought about can I have it? Is it too expensive? And I've never been okay before. I don't know yet, he said honestly. But I know we're not leaving him somewhere that's not better than where he was. Thor, who had been very quiet, said, he stays with us. Both Percy and Annabeth looked at him. Until a better determination is made, Thor said, with the specific calm of a man who has decided something and is informing the room rather than proposing it. He stays with us. That is not a question. Annabeth looked at Percy. Percy looked at Thor. Okay, Percy said. Morning came in hard off the ocean, all light and wind, and Harry was up before anyone else. Percy found him on the rocks below the cottage, sitting at the edge of a tidal pool with his shoes off and his sleeves rolled up, studying the pool's inhabitants with the expression of a scholar encountering primary sources. He had already, somehow, produced a small notebook, which turned out to belong to Annabeth, the spare she kept in her coat pocket, and was making drawings in it with a pencil stub. That's Annabeth's notebook, Percy said, sitting down beside him. She said I could use it, Harry said. I asked. Percy looked at the drawings. They were surprisingly good for a 5-year-old, the tidal pool rendered in careful lines, the anemones identifiable, a crab in the corner clearly a crab. You draw. I teach myself things, Harry said, without looking up. At the library. The library had books about drawing. Right, Percy said. Harry finished his current drawing and looked up at the sea. It was doing what northern seas did in the morning, moving steadily, purposefully, gray-green with white at the edges, the light coming off it in long flat bands. It's like breathing, Harry said, watching the waves. The ocean. In and out. Always has been, Percy said. Harry looked at him. Can I ask you something? Yeah. The thing in my scar, Harry said. Percy went very still. What about it? I can feel it, Harry said, quite calmly. I always could. It's like a cold bit. Right here. He touched the scar with 2 fingers, pressing lightly. I thought everyone had a cold bit. But they don't, do they? Percy looked at this kid, 5 years old and sitting on a rock examining tidal pools and discussing the magical foreign object embedded in his forehead with the equanimity of someone consulting a doctor about something unremarkable, and felt simultaneously proud and furious on his behalf. No, Percy said. They don't. What is it? We don't know yet, Percy said, and made it true rather than evasive by adding, Thor's mother might know. She's an expert in the kind of magic your mother's bloodline has. We're going to ask her today, if that's okay. Today? Harry said. She's coming today. She might already be here, Percy said, because he'd heard, in the very early morning, the sound that Thor's communications made when they were working, a particular vibration in the stone of the cottage that wasn't wind, and Thor had been up long before Percy. Harry looked toward the cottage. Then, apparently deciding that this was satisfactory and the tidal pool was more immediately interesting, he went back to his drawings. Percy sat beside him and watched the sea and thought about nothing useful for a while, which was the most useful thing he could do. Annabeth's tests happened after breakfast, in the open space between the cottage and the lighthouse, with the ocean on 3 sides and the sky vast and clear overhead. She'd set up a series of things that looked casual and weren't, a bucket of water, several flat stones, a length of rope, a candle, and a compass sitting on a rock where she could see it. Harry stood in the middle of it and looked at the array and then at Annabeth. This is more complicated than you said, he said. It's still not a test you can fail, she said. I just want to see what you do. With what? Start with the water, she said. Harry turned to the bucket and looked at it, and the water came up immediately, smoothly, a solid column that he rotated without apparent effort and split into 2 spiraling streams that crossed each other in mid-air without mixing. He kept his eyes on Annabeth while he did it, which meant he was doing it without looking, which Percy had not been able to do until he was 12. Annabeth wrote things down. The rope, she said. Harry looked at the rope, which was coiled on a rock, and it lifted. Percy felt a qualitative shift in the air, not the oceanic pull, something different, lighter and more precise, and the rope rose and unknotted itself and hung in the air in a series of geometric shapes, following something in Harry's mind. That's not sea or storm, Percy said quietly to Thor, who was standing next to him. No, Thor agreed. That is something else. Seer. Something related, Thor said. Instinctive. Untrained. Watch the compass. Percy looked at the compass on the rock. The needle was spinning. Harry was not touching the compass. He wasn't looking at it. He was looking at the rope shapes he'd made with an expression of concentration and something else, something that looked like memory, which was strange for a child who hadn't done this before, but which Percy recognized because he'd felt it himself the first time he'd moved water. Recognition, not learning. Like finding something in a room you'd always suspected was there. "Harry," Annabeth said, "can you feel the storm today?" Harry looked up at the sky. "It's not stormy today." "Not naturally," Annabeth said. "But can you feel it anyway? The potential of it?" Harry went quiet. He let the rope fall back to the rock and the water back to the bucket, and he stood very still with his eyes on the sky, and Percy felt it before he saw it, the pressure drop, the electric quality entering the air, and then the hairs on his arms were standing up and the compass needle had stopped spinning and pointed, not north, but directly at Harry. "Yes," Harry said. "It's always there. Just, quiet. Can you bring a little of it out without calling a storm?" Annabeth said. Harry held out his hand, palm up, and a single arc of electricity ran between his fingertips, bright and clean, smaller than a candle flame. It sat there on his palm, crackling softly, and Harry watched it with a small private smile. "Both at once," Percy said. Harry looked at him. "Try both at once," Percy said. Harry lifted his other hand and a sphere of water rose from the bucket and his two hands came together, water and electricity, and something happened that Percy had never seen happen. The water caught the electricity and held it, lit up from inside with branching light, a sphere of glowing water that turned slowly in the air between Harry's hands like a tiny, contained storm system. The notebook fell out of Annabeth's hands. She bent and picked it up and did not look at it. She was looking at Harry, and her expression was the one she got when she encountered architectural mathematics she hadn't known were possible, not surprise exactly, but a fierce, specific delight. "That," she said, "is not something that should be able to exist." "But it does," Harry said, with complete equanimity, watching the glowing sphere rotate. "But it does," she agreed. It was Thor who first noticed the other presence. He didn't make a dramatic announcement. He simply turned toward the lighthouse, and Percy looked at him and then at the lighthouse, and on the gallery that ran around the top of the tower, the gallery Percy had told Harry not to climb to yesterday, a woman stood looking down at them. She was tall and wore something that wasn't quite the same texture as ordinary clothing, and her hair was gold gray, and she looked at the sphere in Harry's hands with an expression that was not surprise at all. It was recognition. "Frigga," Thor said, with warmth that came from somewhere very deep. "My son," she said, from the gallery, and her voice carried down without effort, clear as struck glass. "You found him." She was looking at Harry when she said it, not Thor. Harry had let the sphere resolve, the water back to its bucket, the electricity fading, and he was looking up at the woman on the tower with the same measuring look he gave everything, head slightly tilted. "Hello," he said. "Hello, Harry," Frigga said. She came down from the gallery via the tower stairs without hurry, and came out of the lighthouse door and crossed the space between them, and when she reached Harry she crouched, the way Percy had crouched in the cupboard, so they were level. Harry met her eyes. "You know my name," he said. "I have known your name for some time," she said. "I knew your grandmother's name, and her grandmother's name, and the name of the woman who first brought the old Vanir magic into your line, many centuries ago." She paused. "I am sorry I did not come sooner." Harry looked at her steadily. "Were you watching too?" he said, and it was not accusatory, just the question of someone assembling a complete picture. Frigga's expression moved, something quiet crossing it, not guilt but its first cousin. "Not watching," she said. "I was aware. There is a difference, though perhaps not enough of one." Harry accepted this with the seriousness it deserved. Then he said, "Can you tell me about the cold bit?" Frigga looked at his forehead. "At the scar." Her expression changed, not in a way that was alarming, but in a way that was very settled and very decisive. "Yes," she said. "I can tell you about it. But first I want to look at it properly, if you'll let me. Will it hurt? No, she said. I would not hurt you. Harry looked at her, making his assessment. Then, solemnly, he nodded. Frigga placed 2 fingers very gently against the scar, and her eyes went briefly distant, and the air around her fingers shimmered with something that was neither lightning nor ocean but something more fundamental, the stuff that came before both, old light, old working. Percy felt it the way you felt a frequency rather than heard it. It lasted about 10 seconds. When Frigga took her hand away, her expression was controlled in the specific way of someone who has processed alarming information and is choosing how to present it. It is a fragment, she said, to all of them, standing up. Fragment of what? Annabeth said. A soul, Frigga said. Damaged, diminished, but present. It belongs to someone who used the darkest kind of magic to anchor themselves past death. She looked at Percy and Thor. Your mother's seer has been containing it, she said to Harry. Keeping it from influencing you. This is why you think clearly. This is why you are yourself. But it's still there, Percy said. It is still there, Frigga agreed. And in time, as he grows and his power develops, the conflict between it and his own magic will intensify. It must be addressed. She paused. But not today. And not quickly. This requires careful preparation. Harry had been listening to all of this. There's a piece of someone evil in my head, he said. Yes, Frigga said, simply, because Harry was clearly someone who preferred directness. And my mum's magic is stopping it from doing anything. Your mother was extraordinarily gifted, Frigga said. Harry looked at the ocean. Will I be able to get rid of it? Yes, Frigga said, with the certainty of someone who has already done the mathematics and arrived at a single answer. Then we get rid of it eventually, Harry said. And until then? Until then, Frigga said, we make you so much yourself that there is no room for it to be anything. Harry looked at her. Then at Thor. Then at Percy and Annabeth. Then back at the ocean. Okay, he said. Let's do that. They were still in the open space, Frigga beginning to explain to Annabeth in the specifics of what she'd felt in the scar, Thor and Percy standing slightly apart, when the apparition crack split the morning air like a whip. McGonagall appeared on the rocks 20 meters away, and she was in full robes, and she'd apparently decided that discreet no longer applied, which Percy took as information about how much pressure she'd been under in the last 18 hours. Harry looked at the woman in robes and pointed glasses who had appeared from thin air on the rocks and said, "That's the cat." "I know," Percy said. McGonagall looked at all of them, Thor and Frigga and Annabeth and Percy and Harry, with the expression of someone whose intelligence is rapidly overhauling their prior briefing. Then she straightened and said, in a tone that was firm and slightly exhausted, "I am Professor Minerva McGonagall. I am here on behalf of Albus Dumbledore." "I know who you are," Percy said pleasantly. "You've been watching Harry for years." "I've been ensuring his safety," she said. "From a distance," Percy said. "While he lived in a cupboard." McGonagall's jaw tightened. "I was not aware of the specifics of his living situation." "He was in a cupboard, Professor," Annabeth said, from her spot near Frigga, in a tone that was harder than her usual voice. "That's a fairly specific. McGonagall looked at Harry. Harry looked back at her with his measuring look and said, "Hello, Mrs. Fig's cat." Something moved in McGonagall's expression, old guilt or something adjacent to it. "Hello, Harry," she said, and her voice was softer. "Mr. Dumbledore wants Harry back," Percy said. It wasn't a question. "Mr. Dumbledore wants Harry safe," McGonagall said. He placed a 5-year-old in an abusive home and anchored a blood protection spell to it that kept Harry from getting more than a few miles from the people who were hurting him," Annabeth said, standing up fully and facing McGonagall directly. "He built a cage and called it safety." McGonagall opened her mouth. Then, remarkably, she closed it again. She looked at Harry for a long moment. The blood protection is no longer necessary, Frigga said, from behind Annabeth. McGonagall looked at her, really looked, for the first time, and Percy saw the recognition land. She knew what she was looking at. The magic had a quality that wizarding people could feel even if they couldn't name it, ancient, different, something from before their tradition branched off from the older tree. "Who are you?" McGonagall said, not rudely, but with the genuine uncertainty of someone recalibrating fast. "My name is Frigga," she said. "I am acquainted with the Vanir thread in this child's bloodline." She held McGonagall's gaze with absolute calm. The blood protection Dumbledore placed was working against a foreign piece of magic in this boy's scar, not with it. The anchor needed proximity and love, neither of which the Dursleys provided. What Dumbledore built was theatrical. What Lily Potter's magic did naturally was the actual protection. McGonagall was quiet for a long moment. "He will not accept, with respect," Percy said. "I don't need Dumbledore to accept it. I need him to not interfere, which is a different thing." He looked at her steadily. "Harry is safe. He is fed. He is not in a cupboard. He is with people who," he paused, because the word he wanted was one he hadn't said aloud yet, hadn't quite even named internally, and he looked at Harry, who was looking back at him, sea glass from yesterday still in his hand, and said it anyway, because it was true, "He is with people who are keeping him." McGonagall looked at Harry. "I'm all right," Harry said, to her, which wasn't something she'd asked, which meant he'd seen the question beneath all the other questions. "I'm properly all right." McGonagall looked at him for a long time. The Scottish morning was cold around them and the lighthouse was white against the blue sky and the sea was doing its constant, steady, enormous thing, and Harry stood in the middle of it all looking more present and more real than McGonagall had ever seen him on those quick guilty Privet Drive checks. "Albus will send someone else if I don't bring a full report," she said finally. "Then bring one," Percy said. "Bring an honest one. That's all." McGonagall looked at Percy. At Thor. At Frigga, who returned her look with the serene, specific authority of someone who has absolutely no interest in being challenged but would not start the fight. Then she looked at Harry one more time. "Harry," she said, "are you choosing this?" Harry considered the question with his full gravity, understanding, Percy thought, that she was asking several things at once. He looked at Percy and Annabeth and Thor and Frigga, at the cottage and the lighthouse and the ocean beyond, and then he looked at McGonagall and said, "Yes." Simple. Complete. He wasn't asking for permission and he wasn't hoping for approval. He was just telling her the truth. McGonagall nodded, once, with the precision of someone filing a decision. Then she looked at Percy. "I cannot promise Albus will do nothing." "I know," Percy said. "He believes," she stopped. Started again, choosing words that were honest rather than diplomatic. "He has built a long plan. Harry is the center of it. He will not abandon the plan easily." "I know that too," Percy said. "Tell him that Harry is alive and fed and not in a cupboard, and if he wants to have a conversation about what comes next he can come and have it. But tell him," he looked at Harry again, at the sea glass in his palm, at the glasses repaired with sellotape. "Tell him what Harry said. He chose this. That's not a small thing." McGonagall looked at him for a moment with an expression that was doing something Percy couldn't quite read, something between assessment and something that might, in another context, have been called gratitude. Then she cracked away, sharp as thunder, and they were alone again. Harry turned the sea glass over in his hand. "She felt bad," he said. "Yeah," Percy said. "She did. But she'll still tell him." "Yeah. She will." Harry absorbed this. "And then he'll come. Probably. Is he dangerous?" Harry asked, and it was such a pragmatic question that it almost sidestepped how large it was. "Very," Percy said, honestly. "But not to you. He thinks you're important." "Important how?" Harry said. Percy looked at the scar. Then at Harry's eyes. Then at the ocean. That's a longer conversation, he said. Tonight, maybe. After Frigga teaches us more about the Vanir magic. After dinner. Harry looked at him with those layered eyes. But you'll tell me. Yeah, Percy said. I'll tell you. Okay, Harry said. And picked up Annabeth's notebook, and went back to his tidal pool, and for the next hour Percy and Annabeth and Thor and Frigga talked in low voices at the cottage table while the sound of the ocean came through the open window and from the rocks outside came the sound of a 5-year-old drawing sea creatures and occasionally talking to them in a friendly, conversational way. Percy was halfway through a sentence about Horcruxes, because Annabeth had the terminology now, had been quietly building the framework since Frigga's diagnosis, when he heard something else. A shift in the air that was not oceanic and not Asgardian and not McGonagall's focused apparition. He looked up. In the doorway of the cottage kitchen, leaning against the frame with the specific ease of someone who had been there longer than anyone realized, was a man in a dark green coat with dark hair and eyes that were the deliberate, layered green of someone who had decided that particular color suited them and made the permanent commitment. He looked like someone who found every situation he walked into slightly beneath his intellectual standards but was willing to be engaged if the material warranted it. He was looking at Percy with an expression of polite appraisal. He had been there for, Percy estimated, at least 10 minutes. Jackson, he said pleasantly. You're faster than I expected. I had you arriving at the Child in September at the earliest. He tilted his head. What was it? A quest. Artifact retrieval, Percy said, and had Riptide in his hand without any theatrical movement, just ready. Loki looked at it without alarm. He looked at Thor with a complicated warmth that he was only partially suppressing. He looked at Frigga, and his expression did something it hadn't done for anyone else, something less managed, more real, something that had the texture of a genuinely felt thing. Mother. Loki, Frigga said, and her voice was exactly what it had been for everything else, steady and complete, with the specific quality of someone who has loved a difficult person for a long time and has not stopped. You knew about Harry, Thor said, and it was not quite an accusation, but it was moving in that direction. I've known about Harry for 3 years, Loki said pleasantly. I identified the Vanir connection on a routine survey of British magical signatures. I found it interesting and chose to observe rather than intervene. You chose to watch a kid in a cupboard, Percy said. Loki looked at him. I chose to watch the development of the most magically complex heritage I had encountered in 300 years, yes. You are welcome to be morally outraged. I find I don't particularly need you to. He was 5, Percy said, and it came out harder than it usually would because Loki was the kind of person who required that. He is 5, Loki agreed, without any evasion. And he is extraordinary. And now he is here, on a Scottish beach, learning to be himself, which is considerably better than where he was 3 days ago, so perhaps the timeline worked out. Because Percy intervened, Annabeth said sharply. Because Percy intervened, Loki agreed, and said it with total sincerity that was somehow more irritating than irony would have been. I did not say I was the hero of this story. I said I was observing it. From outside, footsteps on the stone path, and Harry appeared in the kitchen doorway. He looked at Loki with the same assessment he gave everyone, and Loki looked back at him with something that was, Percy thought, genuine curiosity, the realest thing he'd shown yet. You're the one who's been in the sideways place, Harry said. Every adult in the room went still. Loki blinked. I beg your pardon. There's a sideways place, Harry said, with the certainty of someone reporting something obvious, that's not the normal world but it's next to it. I've seen you there. You were watching. He tilted his head. You have the same eyes as me. Loki looked at Harry's eyes. At the vivid, specific green. Then, involuntarily, he looked at his own reflection in the darkened window above the kitchen sink. Percy watched something happen in Loki's face that Loki clearly had not anticipated and did not have a prepared response for. That is, Loki said, and stopped. "They're a good color," Harry said charitably, and went to the refrigerator and got out an apple and went back outside to his tidal pool. Loki stood in the kitchen doorway in a silence that was, for the first time since his arrival, not entirely managed. Frigga's expression held the small, private warmth of someone watching something move that hasn't moved in a long time. "Well," Percy said. "Don't," Loki said, with considerable feeling. Outside, the sound of the ocean continued, patient and enormous, and Harry's voice drifted through the window talking to something in the tidal pool, explaining, with great earnestness, what he'd learned today about electricity in water. Chapter 4, The Color of Thunder. 3 days into their stay at the lighthouse, Harry stopped flinching at sudden noises. Percy noticed it the way he noticed most things about Harry, sideways, without making it obvious he was watching, because Harry had a radar for being observed that had clearly been calibrated by years of needing to know where threats were coming from. But the flinching had been there on day one, a small involuntary tightening at unexpected sounds, a door closing, Thor setting Mjolnir down on the kitchen table, Annabeth's laugh which came out sudden and bright when she was genuinely amused. By day 3 it was gone, replaced by the attentive stillness that was Harry's natural mode when something interested him. What interested Harry, Percy was learning, was essentially everything. He wanted to know how tidal pools maintained their ecosystems. He wanted to know why Mjolnir returned to Thor's hand and whether it was magnetism or something else entirely, and Thor had given him a very honest answer about enchantment and intent that Harry had filed away and then tested by standing at various distances and seeing if he could feel the enchantment, which he couldn't yet but which hadn't discouraged him. He wanted to know what Annabeth was studying in her notebook, and Annabeth had started explaining her architectural notation system, which was intended to be a simple overview and had turned into 2 hours of Harry asking questions that kept pushing the explanation forward into territory Annabeth hadn't planned to cover. "He's going to be insufferable," Annabeth told Percy that evening, in the tone she used for things she found privately delightful. "He's 5, Percy said. "He understood load-bearing stress distribution," she said. "He asked me about cantilevers." "He's a very advanced 5, Percy said. "He asked me if the lighthouse could handle Asgardian weather events." She paused. "I didn't know the answer. I had to go check the foundation." Percy smiled into his coffee. The training had taken on a rhythm. Mornings were Percy and the ocean. Harry's sea magic was advancing fast, faster than anything Percy could attribute to normal demigod development, and he'd started pushing harder, asking Harry to do things with larger volumes of water, more precision, more sustained control. Harry never failed. He came close to the edge of his control and pushed past it the way naturally talented people did, not by forcing but by relaxing, letting the power settle into its own shape. Afternoons were Frigga and the seer work, which Percy mostly watched from a respectful distance because it was operating on a frequency he couldn't fully track. Frigga would sit with Harry in the open space near the lighthouse and they'd work in a quiet, unhurried way, Harry learning to sense the threads of the old magic in his bloodline, learning to distinguish his mother's working from his own natural power, learning, most importantly, to feel the cold spot in his scar as separate from himself. Something outside. Not Harry. The distinction, Frigga said, was going to matter. Harry was remarkably good at it. Too good, almost, but then everything Harry did was too good, too fast, too intuitive, and Percy had stopped being surprised by it and started just noting it and asking the next question. Evenings were Loki. This had not been planned. Loki had stayed, which no one had explicitly invited but no one had quite found a good reason to prevent, and which Frigga clearly considered natural and inevitable in the specific way mothers considered things natural and inevitable, and had taken to sitting on the cottage wall in the evenings while Harry did his last practice of the day, and at some point on the second evening Harry had gone and sat next to him and they'd started talking, and Percy had found himself in the uncomfortable position of knowing he should probably keep a closer eye on this and also knowing that whatever was happening between Harry and Loki was genuinely something and interfering would wreck it. They talked like equals. That was the strange part. Not in the way adults talk down to children, and not in the way Loki might condescend to most people, but a genuine back and forth in which both of them were bringing something the other didn't have. Loki told Harry about Asgard in the specific, uncurated way he told stories, not the official version, the complicated messy real version, with all the politics and the grudges and the moments that didn't reflect well on anyone. Harry asked questions that cut directly to the most interesting parts, with the instinct of someone who had read enough library books to know that the footnotes were usually where the real information lived. On the third evening, Percy had heard Harry ask Loki, "Were you always angry at people or did something happen first?" And Loki had been quiet for so long that Percy had thought the question had broken something, and then Loki had said, very quietly, "Something happened first," and Harry had nodded like this confirmed the hypothesis and said, "That's what I thought," and the conversation had moved on, but Percy had seen something in Loki's face in the moment after, a door opened somewhere, just briefly, just a crack, and Loki had been surprised by the draft. It was the fourth morning that everything changed. Percy woke up to the specific atmospheric quality of too much electrical charge and came out of his bedroom to find Harry not in the cottage. He was in the open space near the lighthouse in the grey pre-dawn, and he was doing something Percy had never told him to do, working both powers simultaneously, sea and storm, without the controlled sphere exercise they'd been doing with Annabeth's prompting. This was bigger. This was Harry, alone at 5:30 in the morning, with a column of water risen from the ocean to his right and a sustained arc of electricity running from his left hand to a point about 15 meters away, and his eyes were open and his face was the focused, inward look that meant he'd gone somewhere internal. Percy stopped in the cottage doorway and did not intervene. The two powers were doing something that Annabeth had noted in the sphere exercise but hadn't seen at this scale. They were interacting, the electricity threading into the water and the water conducting it in a network of branching light, and the whole combined structure was rotating slowly, and it was vast. It was big enough that the light coming off it was casting shadows in the pre-dawn dark, and Harry was utterly steady in the middle of it. Thor appeared at Percy's shoulder. Percy heard him take a breath. "I haven't seen anything like that since," Thor said, and stopped. "Since what?" "Since Asgard," Thor said, quietly. "The Bifrost does something similar. At the junction of energies." "He's 5, Percy said, mostly to himself. "His power is not 5, Thor said. "His power is old. It has been waiting." Harry dropped everything, not lost control, chose to end it, and the water fell back to the ocean in a clean sheet and the electricity faded. He stood for a moment with his hands at his sides, then turned and saw them in the doorway. He wasn't out of breath. He looked like he'd been doing something satisfying rather than something exhausting. "How long have you been up?" Percy asked. "A while," Harry said. "I couldn't sleep. I kept feeling the ocean." He looked back at where the column of water had been. "I wanted to see how big I could make it." "How big could you make it?" Percy said. Harry looked at the ocean. "Bigger," he said, and left it there. They went inside for breakfast, and Harry ate with the focused enthusiasm he'd developed since leaving Surrey, not the anxious hoarding of the first morning but the straightforward pleasure of someone who had remembered that food was good, and then Loki came in from wherever Loki slept, which remained unclear, and got himself tea, and Thor and Frigga came from the 2 bedrooms at the end of the hall, and for a few minutes the cottage kitchen held all of them in the early morning light with the ocean through the window and the smell of toast, and Percy looked around at it and thought about how strange life was and how it had a way of assembling things you hadn't known you needed. Then the wards went off. Not loudly. Annabeth had set them the second day, a low-level perimeter that would register any magical incursion, the kind that gave you 20 seconds of warning rather than a dramatic alarm, because she'd said that dramatic alarms made people stop thinking and they couldn't afford that. A subtle vibration ran through the stone of the cottage, felt rather than heard, and every person in the kitchen went still. "What kind?" Percy said. "Not apparition," Annabeth said, already moving to the window. "Too sustained. Someone came through at a distance and is moving on foot." "Multiple someones," Loki said, setting down his tea with a precise click, and his voice had shifted into something that had no performance in it at all, something flat and very focused. 7. No, 9. I can feel the workings from here. Dark magic. Old. Percy had riptide out. Thor had Mjolnir in his hand, full size, the weight of it changing the pressure in the room. Frigga was very still by the kitchen table with her hands loose at her sides in the particular way that meant she was already working, threads of sear moving in the air around her fingers that were visible if you knew how to look. Harry was standing by the kitchen table with his chin up and his sea glass in his left fist, and his expression was not scared. Death Eaters, Annabeth said, from the window. Based on the robes. She looked at Percy. How do they know we're here? Horcrux resonance, Frigga said. As I told you, as Harry's power grows, it is destabilizing the anchor magic. Whoever planted that fragment in his scar used Horcruxes as anchoring points throughout the magical world. Harry's development disrupts them. They signal back. Like a homing beacon, Annabeth said. Like a homing beacon, Frigga confirmed. Harry looked at Percy. What do you need me to do? Stay close, Percy said. Let us, Percy, Harry said, and his voice was 5 years old and also completely certain. Let me help. Percy looked at him. At those old, extraordinary eyes, at the 5-year-old who had risen before dawn to practice combining two kinds of impossible power. He thought about what he told Harry on the beach, don't apologize for your power. He thought about what Frigga had said, make him so much himself there's no room for anything else. He thought about the cupboard. He thought about don't. Stay in the perimeter, Percy said. Nothing past the cottage line. And listen to me if I tell you something. Harry nodded, once. Not eagerly, deliberately. They came through the wards at the northeast edge of the property, 9 figures in dark robes that moved with the particular aggressive certainty of people who had been told their target was an unprotected child, and they came fast, spreading into a line as they crossed the rocky ground toward the cottage. Percy went out the front door first. The morning air was cold and moving and the sea was loud, and he stood on the cottage threshold and looked at the 9 Death Eaters organizing themselves across his sightline, and he said, loud enough to carry, turn around. The figure at the center of the line laughed. Male, probably, mask slightly askew, wand out. A boy, he said, to the ones flanking him. They sent a boy. I'm not sent, Percy said. I live here. You're trespassing. The boy, the Death Eater said, with the particular emphasis that meant Harry. Give us the boy. We have no quarrel with Muggles and their gods. That's a shame, Thor said, stepping out of the cottage to Percy's right, and Mjolnir was fully in his hand, and the sky above the lighthouse had noticed, was already changing, the clouds building with the speed of something intentional. I have some quarrel with you. Frigga stepped out to Percy's left, and the air around her hands was not subtle anymore, it was visible, the seer working in gold and silver threads that moved with conscious purpose, and the Death Eaters on the left flank hesitated. Last time, Percy said. Turn around. The spell fire started from 3 points simultaneously, which told Percy these were trained, not amateurs, and he was already moving, riptide up and deflecting the first 2 curses with the flat of the blade because celestial bronze turned dark magic the same way it turned monsters, and the curses cracked against it with a sound like breaking glass, and Percy went forward rather than back because forward was always faster. The ocean answered him without asking. A wave, significant, deliberate, rose from the sea below the promontory and came over the rocks in a directed surge, not a flood, a weapon, and 3 Death Eaters went down in it, robes dragging them sideways, footing gone. Percy followed it in, closing distance, and the 4th one hit him with a stunner that he sidestepped because he'd been fighting people who were faster and stronger than him since he was 12, and the footwork was automatic now, and he got riptide under the Death Eater's wand arm and the celestial bronze hilt across the jaw, and the Death Eater sat down hard. Thor had gone right, and the 2 on the far flank had made the predictable mistake of trying to hit him with spell fire, which worked fine on people who weren't carrying an Asgardian war hammer in a building storm, and the first bolt of lightning that came down from the clouds above hit between the 2 of them with the specific accuracy of Mjolnir's guidance and put them on their backs. Frigga had taken the central ones, not violently, but efficiently, the seer working wrapping around wands and pulling them, leaving the Death Eaters with empty hands and expressions of naked confusion. The way people looked when magic they understood completely failed to respond the way it should. The whole thing had taken 45 seconds. Which was when the 10th one appeared. He'd been holding back. Smart, waiting for the initial response, mapping the coverage, looking for the gap. He came from the south side of the lighthouse and he was alone and he was faster than the others, and his trajectory was not toward Percy or Thor or Frigga. His trajectory was toward Harry. Percy spun and he was too far away and he knew it. Harry was standing exactly where Percy had told him, in the cottage line, within the perimeter, and he saw the Death Eater coming and he didn't run. He looked at him with those steady eyes and he put one hand out, low, the way Percy had seen him do when he was asking the ocean for something. The Death Eater raised his wand. The ground between them became the ocean. Not a wave, a column of water that rose from nowhere, from the damp of the rocky ground itself, from the moisture in the cold air, and it was not a small column, it was substantial and it was hard and it hit the Death Eater at full force from below and the man went up and came down and stayed down, and the water resolved back into nothing, and Harry stood where he'd been standing, hands still slightly out. He lowered it. He looked at Percy. Percy looked at him. He was going to curse me, Harry said, factually. I know, Percy said. So I stopped him, Harry said. Yeah, Percy said. You did. Harry looked at the unconscious Death Eater on the rocks. Not with satisfaction, exactly, with the serious, thoughtful look he brought to everything. Is he dead? No, Percy said, walking over and checking. Alive. Concussed, probably. Good, Harry said. I didn't want him to be dead. I just wanted him to stop. Percy looked at him for a long moment. That, he said, is exactly the right thing to feel. Harry looked at the column of water and did something complex and private in his expression, then looked at his hand, then at Percy, and said, very quietly, it felt like asking. Not forcing. That's what power should feel like, Percy said. When you're doing it right. Annabeth appeared from the eastern side of the cottage, slightly out of breath, having apparently dealt with something around the back that Percy hadn't seen. She looked at the unconscious Death Eaters. She looked at Harry. She looked at Percy with a single raised eyebrow. He handled the 10th one, Percy said. I see that, Annabeth said. He did it right, Percy said. Annabeth looked at Harry. Harry looked back at her. The ground has moisture in it, Harry said. From the sea air and the rain. I asked it to be water again for a second. Asked it, Annabeth said. Harry said. Annabeth made a note. Thor was binding the conscious ones with something that looked like rope but behaved more like a restrained enchantment, moving through them methodically while the storm he'd called wound back down overhead, the clouds dispersing, the sea returning to its ordinary traffic. Frigga was standing in the center of the rocky ground with her hands still working, running something that Percy identified, after a moment, as a diagnostic, checking the perimeter, looking for additional threats, mapping the magical residue of the attack. Loki was sitting on the cottage wall. He had been sitting on the cottage wall for the entirety of the fight. Percy looked at him. I observed, Loki said, without any defensiveness. I have decided I am the strategic reserve. The strategic reserve did nothing, Percy said. The strategic reserve watched everything, Loki said, and has several useful observations, if you're interested. He looked at Harry. Your water work is pulling from a wider radius than you know. When you called the column just now, I felt the draw from as far as the cove below the cliffs. He tilted his head. You should know your range. Harry looked at Loki with interest. How far was that? 300 meters, approximately, Loki said. Harry processed this. I didn't know it went that far. That is precisely my point, Loki said. Annabeth had her notebook out. We need to move the bodies, Percy said. Not bodies, Annabeth said. The unconscious people, Percy corrected. Agreed, Annabeth said. And we need to talk about what this means in terms of location security. She looked at Percy. They found us in 4 days. If the Horcrux resonance is active and getting stronger as Harry develops, we cannot stay static, Frigga said, from across the rocky ground. Whoever seeks the boy will have others to send. Where do we go? Percy asked. Asgard, Thor said. Everyone looked at him. You said you were coming anyway, Percy said slowly. I said I would bring Harry to show him the Bifrost glass, Thor said. I am now saying something different. I am saying that Asgard is the one place the Death Eaters cannot follow, and I am saying that Frigga can work on the scar question in the right conditions, and I am saying, he looked at Harry directly. I am saying you should see your inheritance. Both of them. Camp Half-Blood for the sea, and Asgard for the storm. He paused. In Asgard, no one can touch you. Harry was looking at Thor with the full focused attention that meant he was taking this very seriously. What about Percy and Annabeth? They come, Thor said. What about Loki? Harry said. Loki looked caught, briefly, an expression that sat strangely on his face, the expression of someone who hadn't expected to be included in the variable list. I live in Asgard, he said, carefully. Nominally. Then you'll be there, Harry said, with the satisfaction of a solved problem. Loki opened his mouth. Closed it. His expression did the thing it had done on the third evening on the wall, the door thing, the crack of draft. Yes, he said. I'll be there. The practical work of the next hour was unglamorous. The Death Eaters, all 9 conscious, the 10th still out, were bound and tagged with a magical locator Frigga prepared, which would alert the nearest wizarding authority once activated, giving them enough time to be somewhere else entirely. The cottage needed a basic clear-out, their few belongings gathered, the kitchen left respectably clean because Annabeth had strong feelings about leaving borrowed spaces worse than you found them. Percy was in the kitchen when he heard it. The apparition crack was different from McGonagall's, more deliberate, heavier, the sound of someone who moved through space with complete authority, the sound of someone who had done it 10,000 times and still considered the act significant. He came out of the kitchen to find Albus Dumbledore standing on the rocks outside the cottage, 30 feet from the bound Death Eaters, taking in the scene with the calm, unhurried eyes of someone who had walked into unexpected situations for a very long time. He was tall, silver-bearded, half-moon spectacles, the robes and the hat and the whole apparatus of authority made textile. He looked at Percy and at Thor and at Frigga and the bound Death Eaters, and he looked, last, at Harry, who was standing just outside the cottage door with his arms loose at his sides. Harry, Dumbledore said, and his voice was warm in the way that good voices were warm, deep and steady, the voice of someone who had earned trust from a great many people. Hello, Harry said. Not sir. Not anything deferential. Just hello, clean and level. Dumbledore's eyes lingered on Harry for a moment, on the scar, on the eyes, on the posture that was nothing like the contracted shape of the cupboard, and something moved through his expression that Percy couldn't entirely read. Recognition, maybe. Or recalculation. You look well, Dumbledore said. I am well, Harry said. Better than before. Dumbledore's gaze moved to Percy. You are Perseus Jackson. Percy, Percy said. Your reputation is considerable, Dumbledore said, and it was not quite a compliment and not quite a warning. I was not aware your purview extended to the British wizarding world. Harry's Poseidon's bloodline, Percy said. That's my purview. Partially, Dumbledore said, and looked at Thor. Thor Odinson, Thor said, and offered no additional information, which was a power move Percy respected. And Frigga of Asgard, Dumbledore said, and there was something in his voice now that was more careful, more considered. I had not anticipated the Vanir thread developing so quickly. You knew, Percy said. I suspected, Dumbledore said. I thought it dormant. Nothing about this boy is dormant, Frigga said. Dumbledore looked at her with the particular attention he'd give to an equal. "No," he said. "I see that." He looked at Harry again, and Percy watched his face do something complicated, something that was the internal working of a plan meeting an unexpected variable. "Harry. The people who attacked here today, this will not be the last such attempt." "I know," Harry said. "You are safer within the wizarding world's protections," Dumbledore said. "There are places, measures, that can be taken." "You mean Privet Drive," Harry said. Dumbledore's expression shifted. "In time. Rebuilt, perhaps, with better." "No," Harry said. "One word. Flat, complete, carrying no aggression but also no opening." Dumbledore looked at him. At the 5-year-old who had said no to Albus Dumbledore with the absolute unconcerned certainty of someone who had never been given a reason to be impressed by authority. "Harry," Dumbledore said, gently. "I'm not going back," Harry said. "Not to them and not to a place like them. I've decided." "You are 5 years old," Dumbledore said, and it wasn't cruel, it was the genuine concern of someone who believed children needed guidance. "The decisions that govern your safety cannot rest on what a 5-year-old has decided." "Then they rest on what I've decided," Percy said, stepping up to Harry's right, "and what Thor has decided, and what Frigga has decided. And we've decided he's with us." "You have no legal standing in the wizarding world," Dumbledore said, still patient, still reasonable, still doing the thing where he was the most sensible voice in the room. "With respect," Annabeth said, from the cottage doorway, and she had her notebook closed in one hand and her grey eyes were very direct, "you placed a child in an abusive home because your calculation said the blood protection outweighed his welfare. That calculation was wrong. The protection was Lily Potter's, not the Dursleys. You got the variable wrong." A silence. Dumbledore looked at Annabeth. "You are very well informed." "I have Frigga's assessment and 4 days of direct observation," Annabeth said. "And I'm very good at calculations." Dumbledore turned back to Harry. Percy watched him making a decision about something, working through some internal architecture, and whatever he found there had an expression crossing his face that was tired in a way that his public face wasn't, old and tired and aware, briefly, of the weight of the plan he'd built. "There is more at stake than your comfort, Harry," he said, softly. "I know about the Horcruxes," Harry said. Dumbledore went very still. "Who told you?" "Frigga told me what's in my scar," Harry said. "Percy told me about the bigger picture. I know what I am and why it matters." He met Dumbledore's eyes behind those repaired glasses. "And I know that you left me in that cupboard on purpose." Dumbledore looked at Harry for a long moment. The morning had gone full now, the light off the sea bright and flat, and the 9 bound Death Eaters were a surreal still life in the background, and the lighthouse was white against the sky, and Harry stood in the middle of it all looking at the most powerful wizard in Britain without any performance of anything. "I did what I believed was necessary," Dumbledore said. "I know," Harry said. "So did the Dursleys." Something crossed Dumbledore's face. Not guilt, guilt was too simple. Something bigger and more honest than guilt, something that had the texture of genuine confrontation. He stood with it for a moment in the cold morning air. Then he looked at Percy. "He will need to return to the wizarding world eventually," he said. "His education, we know," Percy said. "We're not running forever. We're building a foundation. When he comes to your world, he'll come on his own terms." "The prophecy, he knows about the prophecy," Percy said. "Or enough of it. And knowing it doesn't mean we hand him over to it." Dumbledore was quiet for a moment. "And if Voldemort rises again before you're ready?" "Then we handle it when it happens," Percy said simply. "Same as everything else." Dumbledore looked at him. At the certainty in Percy's voice, which was not bravado, was the settled certainty of someone who had survived things Dumbledore had only read about, someone for whom monsters and gods and impossible situations were just Tuesday. He looked at Harry one more time. "Will you be safe?" "Yes," Harry said. "You're certain?" I'm going to Asgard, Harry said. I think that counts as safe. Something happened in Dumbledore's face then that Percy would think about later, a small, very private thing that might, under other circumstances, have been the beginning of a smile. It does rather, he said, quietly. He looked at all of them. He looked at Frigga last. Frigga. The scar. I know, she said. It cannot remain. I know, she said again. We will address it in the proper time and the proper way. Not your way. The right way. Dumbledore looked at her for a long moment. Then he inclined his head, fractional, the specific depth of one significant power acknowledging another. Not submission. Recognition. I will not interfere, he said. For now. That's all I'm asking, Percy said. For now. Dumbledore looked at Harry one final time, and in his eyes behind the half-moon spectacles was something Percy thought might be the closest Albus Dumbledore ever came to remorse, that specific, contained look of a man who had made a calculation and was standing next to the cost of it, and finding the cost larger than the ledger had suggested. Be well, Harry, he said. I am, Harry said. That's the whole point. Dumbledore cracked away, and he was gone, and the air settled back into the ordinary cold morning, and the sea said what it always said, and the bound Death Eaters were a problem for the next 20 minutes rather than the rest of their lives. Harry looked at the spot where Dumbledore had been. He's not bad, he said. No, Percy agreed. But he's wrong, Harry said. Yeah, Percy said. He is. Harry turned to him with those eyes that held everything he felt without performing any of it. Thank you for saying so. Most people pretend people can't be both. Percy looked at him for a moment. Then he put his hand briefly on Harry's shoulder, not protective, not consoling, just there, just present, and said, Come on. Let's pack. By midday the lighthouse cottage was empty, the Death Eaters activated and waiting for discovery, Frigga's perimeter dissolved, and the Range Rover was loaded. Harry had done one last walk to the tidal pool and left Annabeth's notebook balanced on the largest rock with the drawings he'd done inside it. You can keep it, Annabeth said. It's yours, Harry said. But I thought you might want the drawings in it. She'd looked at the drawings, the tidal pool, the anemones, the careful crab in the corner, the lighthouse in the distance, small and white, and in the foreground of one drawing, 4 figures on the beach, rendered in pencil by a 5-year-old hand, slightly inexact but immediately recognizable. Percy and Thor side by side, Annabeth on a rock, and Harry himself standing at the water's edge with his hand out and a sphere of light between his fingers. Annabeth had put the notebook in her bag without another word. They drove south toward a field outside Inverness where Thor had arranged the Bifrost contact, because the Bifrost needed open sky and enough space for the light, and Thor had spent 20 minutes on the phone with someone named Heimdall explaining that there would be 5 passengers not 3, and one of them was a child, and no, the child did not need the standard arrival protocol adjusted, the child was fine. In the back seat, Harry was asleep again within 10 minutes of the car moving, head against the window, glasses fogging the glass. Loki was in the passenger seat, which Percy found slightly alarming and Annabeth found logistically convenient because it gave her a full seat in the back. He'll sleep through anything now, Percy said quietly, of Harry. Safe people do, Loki said, without looking up from the window. Percy glanced at him. Loki was watching the Scottish landscape slide past with an expression that wasn't his usual managed performance of mild interest. He looked, actually, like someone watching something he hadn't expected to want to watch. Did you actually not intervene today, Percy said, or were you doing something I didn't see? Loki considered this for a slightly too long moment. Define intervene, he said. Did you do anything? Another pause. When the 10th one came around the south side, Loki said, I may have adjusted the moisture content of the ground in his path to make it easier for Harry to access. Percy stared at the road. You helped. I adjusted a variable, Loki said. It is not the same thing. Loki. It is categorically not the same, you helped, Percy said. Loki was quiet for a moment. He asked the ground to be water, he said, and his voice was different again, the real version, the door-open version. The least I could do was make sure it was listening. Percy looked in the rearview mirror at Harry, asleep in the back seat, the scar visible on his forehead above the fogged glasses. Thought about the column of water rising. About it felt like asking, not forcing. About the Death Eater sitting down hard on the Northumberland rocks, and Harry standing where he'd been told to stand, doing exactly what he'd needed to do, no more. Good, Percy said. Loki returned to the window. The field outside Inverness was flat and grey and enormous, and they parked at the edge of it, and Harry woke up when the car stopped and looked at the open sky and said, "Is this where the Bifrost comes?" "Yes," Thor said. Harry climbed out and stood in the field with the wind moving through his chaotic hair, looking up at the grey Scottish sky, and there was a quality to his attention that Percy recognized from the first morning on the beach, the total presence, the turning toward. Thor raised Mjolnir and the sky responded instantly, because it always did, because for Thor weather was not something that happened but something he was in ongoing conversation with, and the clouds parted around a specific point and the light that came through was not Scottish morning light, was not any kind of earthly light, was something that had no category in Percy's experience, prismatic and enormous and warm in a way that was different from sunlight, warm in the structural sense, warm in the way foundations were warm. Harry's face, upturned into the Bifrost light, went completely open. The sea glass was in his hand and the Bifrost light came through it and the light on his palm was blue and alive, exactly the way Thor had described the shore glass in Asgard, and Harry looked at it and then up at Thor and his expression was the purest thing Percy had ever seen on any face anywhere. Yes, Harry said, for the second time that week. The Bifrost took them. The Scottish field was empty. Below the headland 3 hours south, the lighthouse stood on its promontory in the afternoon light, and the tidal pool was quiet, and on the largest rock Annabeth's notebook sat with its pencil drawings inside it, and the ocean came in around the rocks in the steady, patient way oceans did, saying what it always said. In the distance, the first of the Ministry wizards arrived at the rocky promontory to find 9 bound Death Eaters and no one else, and looked at the lighthouse and the empty cottage and the tidal pool, and found in the largest pool a single piece of pale blue sea glass that nobody had put there, which caught the afternoon light and held it, and which the wizard pocketed automatically, not knowing why, and carried back to London, where it sat on a windowsill in an office in the Ministry of Magic for many years and was sometimes, by people who worked late, noticed to glow very faintly in certain qualities of light, as if remembering something. Chapter 5, What Kings Are Made of. The Bifrost set them down in light. That was the only way Percy could describe arriving in Asgard, not landing, not arriving, but being set down, the way you set something precious on a surface, deliberately, with both hands. The Bifrost Observatory was a tower of gold and glass at the edge of a bridge that went on long enough to make Percy's sense of scale give up entirely, and the light came from everywhere, off the bridge and off the water far below and off the city that spread across the horizon in layers of gold and silver that his eyes kept sliding off because they were too much to take in all at once. Harry stood in the center of the observatory floor and turned in a slow circle and didn't say anything. Heimdall was there, enormous, gold-armored, with eyes that Percy knew from experience saw everything that had ever happened or was currently happening anywhere in the 9 realms, which made Percy feel observed in a very specific and slightly uncomfortable way. He looked at Harry with those all-seeing eyes and something moved in his expression, very faint, that was gone before Percy could name it. "Welcome," Heimdall said, to Harry specifically, with a weight that the word didn't usually carry. Harry looked up at him. "Can you really see everything?" "Yes," Heimdall said. "Can you see the tidal pool?" Harry said. "The one at the lighthouse." Heimdall looked at him for a moment. Then, unmistakably, he smiled. "Yes," he said. "The crab you drew is still there." Harry looked satisfied. "Good," he said. "I liked him." Thor was already moving toward the bridge, and they followed him, Percy and Annabeth side by side, Frigga just behind Thor, Loki a few steps to the side in the particular way he occupied space in Asgard, which was different from how he occupied space on Earth, slightly more careful, slightly more managed, like a man checking his exits. Harry walked next to Percy and looked at everything with the systematic attention he gave everything, but the looking had a different quality here, not the cataloging look, the feeling into it look, his hands slightly out from his sides as if testing the air's texture. "It's older here," Harry said. "Everything is older here," Percy said. "Not just older," Harry said, searching for a word. "Thicker. Like there's more of the magic per, I don't know. Per air. The seer is denser in Asgard," Frigga said, from behind them. "It accumulates over millennia. You are feeling your mother's heritage, recognizing its origin point." Harry considered this. "Like going home, but to a home you've never been to." "Precisely like that," Frigga said. Annabeth had her notebook out before they'd gone 50 meters across the bridge, which Percy found deeply, warmly predictable, and she was drawing the architecture in the quick, precise sketching shorthand she used when she needed to capture things faster than detailed drafting allowed, her eyes moving between the structures ahead and the page with the rhythmic efficiency of someone taking dictation from a building. "The structural logic is completely different from anything on Earth," she said, to no one in particular, because she was technically talking to the notebook. "The load distribution doesn't follow," she stopped. "Percy, the bridge is self-supporting without any visible tension system." "How is the bridge self-supporting without any visible tension system?" "Magic," Percy said. "That's not an answer." "Annabeth, we're in Asgard." "The fact that it's Asgard doesn't exempt it from structural principles," she said, and wrote something with slightly aggressive emphasis. Harry looked at her notebook over her arm. "Maybe the magic is the tension system," he said. "Like, instead of cables it uses the seer to distribute the load through the bridge material itself." Annabeth stopped walking. She looked at Harry. "I'm probably wrong," Harry said. "You're probably right," she said, and wrote it down, and Harry watched her write it with an expression that was trying not to be pleased and failing. The palace was not a building Percy could have described accurately, it was more of a geography than a structure, a landscape of halls and towers and courtyards that went on past any reasonable architectural ambition, golden in a way that wasn't garish, somehow, the gold old and deep-toned rather than ostentatious, earned rather than displayed. Warriors in corridors stopped and looked at them as they passed, not rudely, but with the frank curiosity of people who knew exactly who Thor was and were recalibrating what it meant that he'd arrived from the Bifrost with a child who walked like he knew where he was going. Harry did walk like he knew where he was going, Percy noticed. He didn't huddle or hang back. He walked with his chin level and his eyes moving, taking in everything, occasionally asking Percy or Frigga something in a low voice, and the Asgardian warriors who watched him pass did something Percy found interesting, they didn't look dismissive. They looked, after the first moment of surprise, with a quality of attention that was more like assessment than condescension. Like they saw something in the way he moved and were deciding what category it belonged to. He was 5 years old in a too-big shirt that was one of Percy's, because they'd done laundry at the lighthouse and Harry's things were still 3 sizes too large, and the glasses were still held together with sellotape, and he was nonetheless conducting himself in the corridors of Asgard with the particular self-possession of someone who had decided long ago that the size of a room had nothing to do with whether you belonged in it. They were met, before they reached the throne room, by a woman. She came from a corridor to the left, moving with the specific ease of someone who knew every stone of this building, and she was wearing deep green and her hair was dark and her face had the quality that Percy associated with people who were both formidable and genuinely kind, the combination that was rarer than either separately. She looked at Frigga first, something quick and warm passing between them, then at Thor, and then her eyes found Harry and she stopped. Not dramatically. She just stopped, and looked at him, and her expression did something that Percy, watching it happen, could only call recognition, not the recognition of knowing someone's face, but the recognition of knowing something's nature. "He has Lily's eyes," she said. "Yes," Frigga said. "More than Lily's eyes," the woman said, still looking at Harry. "He has her grandmother's quality." The Vanir, she stopped. Made a decision. Crouched down, as Percy and Frigga had crouched on the lighthouse beach, so she was level with Harry. "My name is Eyre," she said. "I am a healer in this palace. I knew the line your mother came from, a very long time ago." "Healer like a doctor?" Harry said. "Yes," Eyre said. "Can you see what's in my scar?" Harry asked, directly, because Harry did not do preamble when he had a relevant question. Eyre looked at the scar. "I see it," she said. "Frigga has been working on the containment?" "Yes," Frigga said, "from above." "Good," Eyre said, to Harry. "It is held well. You are doing most of the holding yourself, you know. Your mother's magic runs through you like a structure, like columns in a hall. The thing in the scar cannot move because your own magic will not let it." She paused. "You are stronger than it is, Harry. You always have been." Harry looked at her with the steady eyes. "Then why is everyone worried about it?" "Because strength is not the only requirement," Eyre said. "Precision is also required. You can hold a beam by being strong, but eventually you must also know how to set it down correctly." She tilted her head. "Do you understand?" "Yes," Harry said. "You mean I need to know how to do it properly, not just be able to do it?" "Exactly," Eyre said, and stood up, and looked at Percy with a slightly different expression. "You have explained things to him well." "Mostly he explains things to himself," Percy said. Eyre looked at Harry one more time with the specific quality of someone who was both a professional and a person, and the person part was doing something around the eyes. "We will work together before you leave," she said. "Yes." "Yes," Harry said, and it had the business agreement tone. They went on toward the throne room, and Frigga fell back slightly to walk beside Percy, and said quietly, "She is right about the containment. He is doing 90% of it himself. He has been since infancy." "He didn't know he was doing it," Percy said. "The not knowing may have been protective," Frigga said. "If he had known, he might have tried to do it consciously. The unconscious working has been more complete." She paused. "Now that he knows, we must make sure the conscious knowledge supports rather than supplants the instinctive working." "How do we do that?" "We make him trust himself," Frigga said. "Which is what you have been doing since you opened that cupboard door." Percy looked at Harry, ahead of them, who was asking Thor something about the warriors in the corridor in a low voice and listening to the answer with his whole body, and thought about trust and cupboards and the particular architecture of a child who had been told he was nothing for 5 years and was walking through Asgard anyway. "Yeah," Percy said. "We're working on it." The throne room of Asgard was the size of a cathedral crossed with a mountain and decided to be both. Gold and shadow, the ceiling lost somewhere above where torchlight gave up, the throne itself enormous and empty, and it was the emptiness Percy noticed, the specific emptiness of a throne that should have had someone in it. Standing at the far end of the hall, in front of the throne but to the side of it, not on it, was Odin. He was taller than Percy expected and older, the single eye radiating something that went beyond age into something Percy could only call duration, the quality of someone who had existed long enough that existence itself had become a matter of perspective. The eye patch, the grey beard, the ravens somewhere in the upper dark, not visible but present, their attention await in the shadows above. He held a spear rather than a staff. He looked at all of them. His single eye moved over Percy and Annabeth and Loki, a fractional pause on Loki that was doing something complicated, and came to rest on Harry. He looked at Harry for a very long time. Harry looked back. Not up at him, level, because Harry had apparently decided somewhere on the bridge that being 5 was a fact of his current situation and not a factor in his behavior, and he looked at the All-Father of Asgard with his chin level and his green eyes steady and the sellotape on his glasses catching the torchlight. "You are the child," Odin said. His voice was the voice of the thunder before Thor existed, the thunder that had existed for longer than mythology. "I'm Harry," Harry said. "Yes." Odin looked at him. "You are very small." "I know," Harry said. "I'm working on it." Something moved through the throne room. Not sound, something else, something barometric. A shift in the quality of the air, the way air shifted before something important happened. It took Percy a moment to identify it as the Asgardian equivalent of surprised silence, the silence of a hall full of warriors who had never heard anyone address the All-Father like that. Odin's expression moved. Very slightly. Very specifically. The particular movement of a face that is not used to being amused and is encountering the sensation unexpectedly. "Your name is Harry," he said. "Yes," Harry said. "And you have come to Asgard." "Thor invited me," Harry said, with the specificity of someone who wanted the record accurate. "He said I could see the Bifrost glass." "Did he?" Odin said, and looked at Thor with an expression that had approximately 7 conversations in it. "Father," Thor said. "My son brings a child from Midgard," Odin said, "who carries Vanir blood and Poseidon's legacy and something considerably darker in his scar, and this is because of Bifrost glass." The Bifrost glass was mentioned, Thor said, with a dignity that Percy genuinely respected. Odin looked back at Harry. He was quiet for a moment in the way that was not uncertainty but consideration, the difference being that uncertainty moved around its object while consideration moved toward it. "Come here, boy," he said. Harry walked forward across the throne room floor and stopped about 3 feet from Odin, and looked up at him without any of the performance of courage, not performing fearlessness, simply not afraid, which was different and rarer. Odin looked at the scar. He looked for a long time, with that single eye that saw things ordinary sight didn't reach, and his expression moved through several things that Percy couldn't track, and then he looked at Harry's face, at the green eyes, and he said something in Old Norse that Percy didn't understand. Frigga, behind Percy, made a soft sound. "What did he say?" Percy asked her quietly. "He said," Frigga said, equally quiet, "you are more than what was done to you," and her voice had something in it that was warm and careful and slightly unsteady. Odin looked down at Harry. "What do you know of your heritage?" he said. "Percy told me about the Poseidon part," Harry said. "Frigga told me about the Vanir part. I know there's something in my scar that's from someone else." He paused. "I'm still learning the rest." "You are not afraid," Odin said. "Not of this," Harry said. "Not of what I am." Odin was quiet. His single eye moved to Percy, and Percy felt the full weight of it, not hostile, but large, the attention of something very old and very far-seeing landing on him with the specific focus of someone who had decided he was relevant. "You brought him here," Odin said. "We found him," Percy said. "He was already himself. He looked at Harry's back, at the chaotic black hair and the repaired glasses. "We're just making sure he has room to be." Odin looked at him for a long moment. Then he looked at Frigga, and between them passed a conversation that required no words, the specific rapid language of 2 people who had been in each other's company for longer than most histories. "The child stays for 3 days, Odin said, to the hall in general." Thor let out a breath. "He will be treated as a guest of this house," Odin said. "His heritage will be honored." He looked at Harry one more time. "And when you leave as you arrived, whole. Nothing will be asked of you here." He paused, and the pause had weight. "That is not always the case in throne rooms. I want you to know it is the case in this one." Harry looked at him for a moment. Then he said, "Thank you." "Do not thank me," Odin said, which sounded harsh but wasn't. "Simply be what you are. That is sufficient." Harry nodded, with the seriousness this deserved. Then, because he was Harry, he said, "Can I see the Bifrost glass now?" The sound that went through the throne room, not quite a laugh, from the assembled warriors who had been collectively holding something in, was startled and genuine, and even Odin's expression did the thing it had done before, the involuntary flicker of something warm arriving somewhere it hadn't expected to be welcome. "Yes," Odin said. "Thor will take you." The shore below the Bifrost landing was a narrow crescent of pale rock, and the glass was exactly what Thor had said, littered across the rock face in pieces and fragments where centuries of Bifrost landings had fused the stone, and it was blue, and it was alive with color, the light moving through it in branching patterns like slow electricity, like something between water and lightning given a third form. Harry crouched on the rocks and picked up a piece and held it up to the light, and his expression was the one Percy had stopped trying to name because it was too specific to Harry, that open, private look of someone encountering something they'd always suspected existed. "It's like the sea glass," he said. "But more. It is older," Thor said, crouching beside him. "Everything here is older," Harry said, and held the glass fragment between his fingers and looked through it at the light, and the light that came through it was fractured into its components, blue and gold and a green that was specifically the green of the deep ocean, and Harry was backlit by it for a moment, all three colors moving through him, and Percy looked at it and thought about bloodlines and inheritances and the particular way the universe sometimes arranged itself into a picture. "And dared you to miss it?" Harry pocketed the glass. "Can I keep it?" he said. "It is common stone transformed by the Bifrost," Thor said. "There is no law against it." "I wasn't asking about law," Harry said. "I was asking if it was okay." Thor looked at him. "It is more than okay," he said. "Thanks," Harry said, and went back to examining the rocks with the systematic pleasure he brought to tidal pools. The 3 days had a rhythm that nobody planned and everyone fell into naturally, which Percy suspected was the best kind of rhythm. Mornings were Air and Harry in the healing wing, doing the precise scar work that Frigga and Air had agreed on together, which Frigga described as mapping the architecture and which Harry described as finding out exactly where the cold bit ends and I begin, which was the same thing in different language. Percy sat in on the first session and then, at Harry's suggestion, waited outside, which Harry explained by saying, "It's easier to concentrate without you worrying," which Percy could not argue with because he had in fact been worrying. He sat outside the healing wing door and Loki sat beside him, which Percy had not invited and had decided not to fight, and they were quiet together for a while in the specific way of two people who had decided the other was tolerable. "You worry like you're responsible for it," Loki said, eventually. "I am responsible for it," Percy said. "You are responsible for yourself," Loki said. "Harry is responsible for Harry. You can be present for both without conflating them." Percy looked at him. "Are you giving me parenting advice?" "I am giving you philosophical clarity," Loki said, with dignity. "You've never raised a child," Percy said. "No," Loki said, and something moved in his face that Percy filed without comment. "But I know something about people deciding your limits before you've had the chance to discover them yourself." He looked at the healing wing door. "He doesn't need protection. He needs presence. There is a difference." Percy thought about this. Then, Frigga said something similar. "My mother is seldom wrong," Loki said, "which I have spent considerable energy resenting and have recently been reconsidering." "Reconsidering because of Harry?" Percy said. Loki was quiet for a moment. "Harry asked me if something happened first," he said. "Before the anger." He paused. "No one has ever asked me that. They ask what I did. They ask why I did it. They ask what I want. No one asks what happened first." His voice was even, controlled, but the door was cracked open. "A 5-year-old from a cupboard asked me what happened first." Percy said nothing, because nothing was the right response. "He has very good instincts," Loki said, closing the door again but gently, differently from how he usually closed things. "Yeah," Percy said. "He does." The afternoons were Thor's. He took Harry through the training grounds and the armory and along the walls of the palace, showing him Asgard the way Thor knew it, which was not the official diplomatic version but the version of someone who had grown up running in these halls and had strong opinions about which corridors were best for which things. Harry asked about everything. He picked up a practice sword in the armory and held it with 2 hands and looked at it, and an Asgardian warrior named Brunhilde, tall, dark-haired, with the look of someone who had decided very early that the universe had better keep up, watched him from across the room and said, to no one in particular, "He holds it right. No one ever holds it right the first time." "He holds water right too," Percy said, from the doorway. Brunhilde looked at Percy with the expression of someone reassessing a situation from the beginning. What is he? New, Thor said, simply, and it was exactly the right answer. Harry set the practice sword down carefully, where he'd found it, because he was Harry and he put things back. He looked at Brunhilde with the measuring look. Can you teach me sword fighting? You are 5, she said. I know, he said. Will you teach me when I'm older? Brunhilde looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, yes, in a tone that meant she had decided something about this and it was done. Harry nodded, satisfied, and moved on to examine the next thing. Frigga found Percy on the second evening on one of the palace's outer balconies, watching the city below and the water far out and the way the light fell on both of them in the specific Asgardian quality of late afternoon, which was different from any light Percy had seen anywhere, older somehow, more intentional. He is doing very well, she said, standing beside him. I know, Percy said. The scar work is progressing faster than I expected. She paused. He has extraordinary internal clarity. When Air asks him to identify the boundary between himself and the fragment, he finds it immediately. Every time. She looked at the city. Most adults would struggle with that. He finds it because he has always known, instinctively, where he ends and the intrusion begins. He simply never had language for it. His mother's magic, Percy said. His own character, Frigga said. His mother's magic gave him the structure. His own nature gave him the certainty. She looked at Percy. He knows who he is, Percy. Completely and without drama. That is the rarest thing I have encountered in several thousand years of knowing people. Percy thought about this. About the cupboard and the 5 years and the 2 library books. About a child who had had everything stripped away and had still, somehow, kept something at the center that didn't budge. He decided, Percy said. Yes, Frigga said. Somewhere in that cupboard he decided who he was and he just, kept being it, Percy said, and the weight of it was in his voice and he didn't try to take it out. Yes, Frigga said, and the single word was full. They stood together for a moment, looking at Asgard. The scar, Percy said. How long? To remove it properly? Months, she said. It must be done in stages. The fragment must be isolated completely first, then addressed through a working that Harry himself must participate in consciously. She paused. He is old enough to understand the theory. He will not be able to execute it until he is considerably more developed. But the understanding can begin now. She looked at Percy. And it must be his choice. The working will fail if it is not his choice. He'll choose it, Percy said immediately. I know, Frigga said. That is not what I'm concerned about. What are you concerned about? The soul fragment knows what it is, Frigga said, carefully. It is damaged and diminished and largely contained by Harry's own magic, but it is not completely inert. As Harry's power grows, the contrast will increase. Harry becoming more himself will make the fragment feel its containment more acutely. She paused. At some point, it will try to communicate. Percy went still. With Harry. Yes. What happens when it does? Harry decides what happens, Frigga said, simply. That is always the answer with him. The third day Percy spent mostly with Harry, deliberately, because the day before leaving somewhere was always the day you noticed what you'd started to take for granted. They went back to the Bifrost shore in the morning, the 2 of them, and sat on the rocks while Harry arranged pieces of Bifrost glass in patterns, not arbitrary ones, Percy noticed, but ordered ones, the same instinct for geometry that had shaped his tidal pool drawings. Are you happy? Percy asked, after a while, because he was Percy and he asked the direct thing. Harry looked at the glass pattern. I think so, he said. I keep checking and it keeps being true, which is strange because I'm not used to that. Get used to it, Percy said. Harry looked at him. Percy. Yeah. Are you going to keep me? The question landed with the weight of something that had been carried a long time. Not dramatic, Harry didn't do dramatic, he did direct, but the weight was there, the real question underneath the words, the one that had been forming since a cupboard door opened and two strangers crouched down to be level with him. Percy looked at the Bifrost glass. Then at the water far below the bridge. Then at Harry, who was watching him with those green eyes that did not flinch from what they were looking for. "Yeah," Percy said. "I'm going to keep you." "Thor too?" Harry said. "Thor too," Percy said. "And Annabeth." "Annabeth had opinions about your structural theories on day 2, Percy said. "You're hers now whether you like it or not." Harry's mouth curved. "And Loki?" "Loki will say he's observing," Percy said, "and will continue adjusting the moisture content of the ground in your vicinity when necessary." Harry looked at the glass. "And Frigga?" "Frigga is Frigga," Percy said. "She's not a thing you need to check on. She's just going to be there." Harry looked at the light through a piece of glass, the blue and gold and sea green, the 3 colors that had been through him on this shore 2 days ago. "I dreamed about the ocean before I knew what it was," he said. "And the storms. I thought it was just dreaming." He paused. "But it was this, wasn't it? I was dreaming about what I came from." "Yeah," Percy said. "I think so." "I came from really good things," Harry said. Percy looked at him. "Oceans and storms and old magic," Harry said. "That's good things to come from." "Yeah," Percy said, and his voice did something it wasn't supposed to do in the middle of a Bifrost shore conversation, but he let it. "It really is." Harry leaned against Percy's shoulder, the same way he had on the Scottish beach in the rain, and Percy let it happen, and they sat on the rocks of Asgard while the Bifrost light moved through the glass in patterns, and the ocean far below was not Percy's ocean but was still ocean, still the same patient vast thing. The conversation with Loki happened on the 3rd evening. Harry found him in the library, which in Asgard was not one room but several connected halls, the books old enough that some of them had stopped being books and become something else, objects with the compressed weight of everything they contained, and Loki was reading, or appearing to read, with the specific quality of someone who had been waiting for company without admitting it. Percy was at the library entrance, outside Loki's sightline, where Harry had asked him to wait. He could hear them but not see them, which he suspected was what Harry had intended. "You're leaving tomorrow," Loki said, when Harry sat down across from him. "Yes," Harry said. "And you'll come back," Loki said, in the tone of someone establishing a fact. "Yes," Harry said. A pause. Pages turning. "Loki," Harry said. "I know you were watching me before," Harry said. "In the sideways place. For a long time." "Yes," Loki said, with no evasion. "Why didn't you do anything?" "I told Percy I was observing," Loki said. "I know what you told Percy," Harry said. "I'm asking you." A long pause. The library was quiet around them, the old books doing whatever old books did in the dark. "I was afraid," Loki said. It came out plainly, without the usual architecture of performance around it, and Percy, outside the door, went very still. "Not of you. Of, intervening." A pause. "I have intervened in things before. My interventions have not always," he stopped. Started again. "I have caused considerable harm in the name of considered action. I had decided that observation was safer. For everyone. Safer for them or safer for you?" Harry said. Another long pause. "Both," Loki said, and it was completely honest. "Both, and I am not certain which proportion was larger." "That's honest," Harry said. "You have a quality," Loki said, "of making dishonesty feel structurally unsound. Like building on sand." "Mrs. Figg was dishonest with me," Harry said. "She was nice to me but she was watching me for someone else and she never said so. I always knew something was wrong with the picture." He paused. I'd rather know the true thing even if it's bad. Yes, Loki said. I have noticed. Did you care? Harry said. When you were watching. Did you care what happened to me? The longest pause yet. Yes, Loki said. Quiet, undecorated, the single word doing everything. I cared what happened to you. I told myself I was interested in the magical phenomenon. But I cared. A breath. I care. I know, Harry said. I knew before you said it. How? The moisture in the ground, Harry said. Percy heard Loki make a sound that was not quite a laugh and not quite a breath, somewhere between them, the sound of someone caught by something smaller than expected. You are deeply inconvenient, Loki said. You adjusted the ground so I could make the water column, Harry said. You didn't have to. You could have stayed on the wall. Yes, Loki said. So you're not just observing anymore, Harry said. A pause. No, Loki said. I suppose I'm not. Good, Harry said. I think you're better at doing things than watching them. You're just scared of the outcomes. I am thousands of years old, Loki said, and there was a rueful quality in his voice that was the closest thing to self-deprecating humor Percy had heard from him. I am being counseled on my fear responses by a child. Is it wrong? Harry said. Infuriatingly, no, Loki said. Okay then, Harry said, with the tone of a closed issue. I'm going to go find Percy. We're leaving in the morning. I know, Loki said. I'll see you when we come back, Harry said. Yes, Loki said. You will. The sound of small feet moving toward the door, and Percy stepped back from the entrance so Harry didn't catch him listening, and Harry came around the corner and looked at Percy with the knowing, unbothered look that meant he'd known Percy was there. You heard, Harry said. Some of it, Percy said. He'll be okay, Harry said, with the confidence of someone who had made a diagnosis and was reporting the prognosis. Yeah, Percy said. I think he will. Harry slid his hand into Percy's, the same unassuming way he had on the cliff path at Northumberland, and they walked back through the Asgardian evening toward the rooms Thor had given them, and the palace was gold around them and the light was the old Asgardian light, thick with centuries, and Harry held his piece of Bifrost glass in his free hand, turning it over and over, the colors moving through it continuously, alive. In the library, Loki sat alone with his book. He was not reading it. He was looking at the space across the table where a 5-year-old had just told him the truest things anyone had told him in a very long time, and his expression was unmanaged, completely, in a way it almost never was, open and complicated and somewhere in the vicinity of something that needed to be named but hadn't been named yet. Frigga found him there, an hour later. She sat across from him, in the chair Harry had used, and she looked at her son with everything she knew about him, which was considerable, and she said nothing because she didn't need to. Loki looked at his book. He asked what happened first, he said, without looking up. Yes, Frigga said. Before anyone ever asked me, Loki said. He asked. He asks the right questions, Frigga said. Loki turned a page he hadn't read. I am going to be useful, he said. I have decided. Whatever shape this takes, I am going to be useful to him. He paused. Not observing. No, Frigga agreed. Not observing. Loki looked up from the book, at his mother's face, at the steady gold light of the library around them, at the Asgard that had been his home and his exile alternately for longer than most worlds had existed. He said I'm better at doing than watching, he said. He's right, Frigga said. Insufferably so, Loki agreed, and something in his face settled, not resolved, not fixed, but moved, genuinely moved, the way things moved that had been stationary too long and had found a reason to shift. Outside the library windows, Asgard was doing what Asgard did at night, the light changing into something different, not dark but shifted, the gold going deeper, the water below the bridge becoming its own illumination, and somewhere in the palace Harry Potter was asleep in a bed large enough to contain approximately 4 of him, with a piece of Bifrost glass on the nightstand next to the sellotape glasses, and a piece of sea glass from the Scottish beach in his left hand, both of them tucked in like things he'd decided to hold on to. He would hold on to them for a very long time. Chapter 6, Storm enough they came back from Asgard on a Tuesday. Percy knew it was Tuesday because Annabeth's phone had been off the whole 3 days and she'd turned it back on somewhere over the Scottish countryside. They'd come down via the Bifrost to the same Inverness field, which had the scorched grass of a repeat landing and which Percy mentally added to the list of things they'd eventually explain to someone. And she'd spent the drive south fielding messages with the focused efficiency of someone doing battlefield triage on a backlog. "Camp sends their regards," she said, "somewhere around Edinburgh." "How many disasters?" Percy said. "Define disaster." "Things on fire." 2. Both resolved. She looked at her phone. "Chiron wants to know about Harry. Tell him we'll visit when things settle." "When will things settle?" Percy looked in the rearview mirror at Harry, who was sitting between Thor and Loki. Loki had materialized at the Bifrost landing without explanation, which by now was simply what Loki did, and was holding his piece of Bifrost glass up to the car window and watching the morning light through it. "Settle is probably the wrong word," Percy said. "No, it's the right word," Harry said, without looking away from the glass. "Things settle. They just don't stop." Annabeth looked at Percy. Percy looked at Annabeth. "He's been in Asgard 3 days, Percy said, and now he's philosophically precocious." "He was already philosophically precocious," Annabeth said. "Now he has context." Harry lowered the glass and looked at it. "I like that word. Precocious." He tested the syllables. "It sounds like something that knows it's early." Loki, to Harry's left, said nothing, but his expression was the door-cracked version, the genuine one, and Percy caught it in the mirror and filed it. They drove south for 2 hours and the morning opened up around them, grey and clean, and Harry asked questions about the landscape the way he asked questions about everything, not rapid fire, but considered, one leading naturally to the next. So that a question about why the hills were rounded rather than peaked led to a conversation about glaciation that led to a question about whether Asgard had glaciers that led to Thor giving a 20-minute account of a particular storm system he'd once redirected, and by the time they stopped at a service station outside Carlisle for food everyone was involved in a disagreement about whether geological time scales were philosophically distinct from mythological ones, and Harry was eating a sandwich and mediating with the calm of someone who found both sides interesting. "They're the same thing," Harry said, when Percy and Loki reached an impasse. "Geology is just mythology that's been happening so long no one remembers who told it first." Everyone was quiet for a moment. "Write that down," Annabeth said. "I don't have paper," Harry said. She gave him her notebook. He wrote it down carefully, in the large, earnest handwriting of a child who has been practicing, and handed it back, and went back to his sandwich, and Percy looked out at the grey motorway service station car park and thought about how a week ago this child was in a cupboard, and thought about what a week could contain if you let it. They were still sitting in the service station when Percy's phone rang. Unknown number. British. He looked at it for a moment, then answered. Percy Jackson. The voice was Dumbledore's. Percy sat up slightly. Across the table Harry kept eating, but his eyes moved to Percy's face with the quick attention that meant he'd registered the shift. "Dumbledore," Percy said. "I apologize for the abruptness," Dumbledore said, and he sounded, Percy noted, genuinely apologetic rather than performatively so. "I need to tell you something before you hear it from another source." A pause. "The Wisingamot convened yesterday. An emergency session. In my absence." Percy felt something cold settle in his chest. "About Harry." "About Harry," Dumbledore confirmed. "Specifically, about the lawful guardianship of the boy who lived. There are members of the Wisingamot who take a different view of his current situation than I do. They have passed a provisional order. It requires Harry's return to magical guardianship within 72 hours. Or what?" Percy said. Or they will invoke the decree for the reasonable restriction of magical creatures, Dumbledore said, and his voice had gone careful and specific, the way voices went when they were delivering something that required exact language. Specifically the provision that allows for the binding of unregistered magical entities whose activities constitute a threat to the statute of secrecy. The service station car park went very still around Percy. They want to bind his magic, Percy said. They want to use it as leverage, Dumbledore said. Some of them genuinely believe it is a safety measure. Others, he paused. Others have different motivations. I am not in a position to stop the order from proceeding by ordinary means. The votes are sufficient. But you're calling me, Percy said. I am calling you, Dumbledore said, because I believe that what will happen if they attempt this will not be safe for the people attempting it. And because, a longer pause, with something in it that had weight. Because the boy said something to me on that headland that I have been thinking about since. He said you were keeping him. Another pause. I spent a night considering whether I have ever, in all my plans for him, thought of it that way. Percy was quiet. I am not calling to apologize, Dumbledore said. I am calling to warn you, and to tell you that I will not be where the Wizengamot expects me to be when they send their representative at 11 o'clock tomorrow morning. Whether that absence is useful to you is your determination. Percy looked at Harry, who was watching him over the remains of his sandwich with complete calm, having apparently heard enough through Percy's side to have assembled the picture. Thank you, Percy said. Don't thank me, Dumbledore said. Make it worth it. He hung up. Percy set the phone down on the table. They're going to try to bind my magic, Harry said. Percy looked at him. You got that from my side of the conversation. And from your face, Harry said. What's a bind? It's a suppression, Annabeth said, her voice very controlled, her pen absolutely still over the notebook. They would anchor something to your core magic that prevents you from using it. Harry looked at her. Can they do that? They think they can, Percy said. The question is whether they're right. Thor, who had been very still since the phone rang, set Mjolnir on the service station table with a sound that silenced the two people at the next table and made a structural assessment of the table's durability a relevant concern. They will not touch him, he said, and his voice was the thunder before the thunder voice, the one that came before the weather changed. No, Loki said, quietly, and he was looking at his hands on the table, and his expression was completely still, not the managed stillness but the real kind, the kind that meant something had been decided in a place he didn't show. They will not. Harry looked around at all of them. He looked at Thor's expression and Loki's stillness and Annabeth's controlled fury and Percy's face, and then he looked at his piece of Bifrost glass on the table next to his sandwich. Okay, Harry said. What's the plan? The plan was Annabeth's. She built it at the service station table in 45 minutes with 3 napkins and a pen, and it was not a fighting plan and not a running plan. It was something more specific than either, built on the particular Annabeth logic that the best defense of a position was making the position undeniable. They have legal authority within the wizarding world, she said. Fighting that directly makes us the aggressor. Running from it makes Harry look like something that needs to be contained. Neither works. She drew a line on the napkin. What works is making the argument they can't answer. Which argument? Percy said. Harry, she said, simply. Everyone looked at her. They have passed an order based on a legal framework that classifies him as an unregistered magical entity, she said. That framework requires that the entity in question be unable or unwilling to account for themselves. It's a framework designed for magical creatures who can't participate in wizarding legal proceedings. She looked at Harry. Harry can participate in wizarding legal proceedings. He's 5, Percy said. He is extraordinarily coherent, possesses 2 documented divine bloodlines, has been assessed by Frigga of Asgard regarding the nature and safety of his magic, and is presently under the protection of Thor Odinson and the heritage of Poseidon. She looked at Percy. I want him to speak. To the Wizengamot? Percy said. To whoever they send, Annabeth said. One person, not the whole body. That's how these provisional orders work. They send a representative with binding authority to execute or withdraw the order based on direct assessment. She tapped the napkin. They're expecting a child in a cupboard. They are going to meet something considerably different, and I want Harry to be the one they meet first. Percy looked at Harry. Harry was listening with the focused attention he brought to structural explanations, nodding slightly at the logical junctions. I can do that, Harry said. You don't have to, Percy said. I know, Harry said. I want to. It's my magic. I should be the one who says what happens to it. Percy looked at him for a long moment. Yeah, he said. You should. Where? Thor asked. Somewhere we choose, Annabeth said. Not where they designate. We don't accept their ground. We set ours. She looked at Percy. The beach. Northumberland. Percy said. We know it. It's open, it's defensible in the specific sense, and it's connected to Harry's power. She looked at Harry. Also, it's yours. You claimed it first. Harry looked at the sea glass in his hand, the pale blue piece from the lighthouse rocks, which he'd had since their first morning in Scotland. Yes, he said. The beach. They drove through the night. Harry slept in the back seat for most of Yorkshire and woke up somewhere in Durham, looked at the dark motorway for a moment, and said, Percy. Yeah. Frigga said I've been doing the containment mostly myself. The scar thing. Yeah, Percy said. That means the magic doing the containment is mine, Harry said. Which means I'm already doing complicated magical work all the time, and I don't need to be bound because the complicated work I'm already doing is keeping something genuinely dangerous contained. He paused. If they bind my magic, they're not making things safer. They're making them more dangerous. Percy was very quiet. Because if my magic is suppressed, the containment weakens, Harry said. And then whatever's in the scar has more room. He said it very simply, as a logical chain. They're going to make the argument backwards. Their bind makes the bad thing stronger. That, Annabeth said, from the passenger seat, is exactly what you're going to say to their representative. That's also what I'm going to say to their representative, Loki said, from directly behind Percy, where he had apparently been awake and listening for some time. And I, Thor said. And me, Percy said. Harry leaned back against the window. I'm not scared, he said, and it was the flat factual version. I know, Percy said. I'm a bit focused, Harry said. Like the way it felt before the Death Eater came around the side. When I could feel what was going to happen. Tightened up, Percy said. That's good. That's right. That's the thing that makes you fast. Okay, Harry said. Good. He closed his eyes and was asleep again inside 2 minutes, and Percy drove north through the dark toward the sea. They reached the Northumberland coast at 5 in the morning. The beach was exactly as they'd left it, long and grey and empty, the sea doing its constant work at the edge of the world, the headland above it with the hire car's tire marks still visible in the verge. Dawn was an hour off, the sky lightening at the east in the specific way of northern mornings, grey becoming grey-blue becoming the first suggestion of something warmer. Harry stood at the top of the cliff path and looked at the beach and breathed in and the ocean breathed back. Hello, Harry said, to it. The wave pattern shifted slightly. The specific small-scale acknowledgement that Percy had stopped finding extraordinary and started finding reliable. They went down to the beach. No reason to wait on the headland, the beach was theirs, Harry specifically, and there was no strategic benefit in meeting a Wizengamot representative at the top of a cliff path versus at the edge of the sea, except that one of those locations was where Harry's power was and one wasn't, and Annabeth had been very clear about advantageous ground. They waited. The sunrise came in properly around 6, and the light off the sea was that particular morning quality, flat and bright and making everything precise, and the beach held all five of them, Percy and Harry at the waterline, Thor slightly back and to the right, Annabeth on the rock she'd used before, Loki on the cliff path above doing what Loki described as managing the upper approaches and what Percy translated as being somewhere elevated where he could see everything, which was fine. At 6:40, the apparition crack came from the headland above. Not one. 3. Percy looked up. 3 figures in ministry robes came down the cliff path, and the one in front was a woman Percy hadn't seen before, middle-aged, sharp-faced, with the particular authority of someone who had spent decades moving through institutional power and had stopped noticing the weight of it. Behind her, 2 younger wizards, flanking, hands near their wands in the practiced way. She came down the path with purpose and stopped 15 feet from Percy and looked past him at Harry, who was standing at the waterline with the sea behind him and the morning light making everything very specific. "I am Wilhelmina Crouch," she said, with the clipped certainty of someone who expected the name to do work. "Senior Undersecretary to the Minister for Magic. I am authorized to execute or withdraw the provisional binding order regarding the unregistered magical entity designated. His name is Harry," Percy said. She looked at Percy. "I am authorized to execute or withdraw the order following direct assessment," she said, overriding him with practiced ease. "I will need the child, you will need to talk to him," Percy said. "From here. He'll answer your questions." She looked at Harry. Then at Thor, who was standing with Mjolnir in hand in a specific way that was not threatening but was undeniably present. Then back at Percy. "This is irregular," she said. "Yes," Percy agreed. "Go ahead." She looked at Harry for a moment with the expression of someone recalibrating. Harry was looking back at her with the steady, unhurried attention he gave everything, hands loose at his sides, feet at the edge of the tide. "Harry," she said, and to her credit she said it without condescension. "Do you understand what I'm here for?" "Yes," Harry said. "You have an order to bind my magic because the Wisengamot classified me as an unregistered magical entity. The classification assumes I can't account for myself in a wizarding legal proceeding." She blinked. "That's correct. I can account for myself," Harry said. "Would you like me to?" She looked at him for a moment. "Please," she said, and something in her voice had adjusted without her appearing to notice it. "My name is Harry James Potter," Harry said, and he said it with the same plainness he said everything, no performance, just information. "My mother was Lily Potter, née Evans. Her bloodline carries a thread of Vanir seer magic through the Norse heritage. This has been confirmed by Frigga of Asgard, who traced the lineage directly." He paused. "My father was James Potter. His bloodline carries a dormant demigod heritage from Poseidon's line. Percy Jackson, who is the son of Poseidon, identified this." He glanced at Percy briefly, not for confirmation, just acknowledging. "Together these make me something that doesn't have a pre-existing category in the wizarding classification system. That's why you called me an unregistered entity. There isn't a registration for what I am yet." Crouch was very still. The 2 flanking wizards had stopped thinking about their wands and were listening. "There is also something in my scar," Harry said. "I know what it is. It is a soul fragment belonging to Voldemort, placed there when he tried to kill me as an infant." He said Voldemort without a flicker, without the flinch that Percy had noticed most wizarding people did with the name. "My mother's Vanir magic has been containing it since before I could walk. My own developing power is continuing that containment." He looked at Crouch directly. "If you bind my magic, the containment weakens. The fragment has more room. That is not safer for anyone. It is specifically less safe for the wizarding world you are trying to protect." The beach was quiet except for the sea. Crouch looked at Harry for a long moment. Percy watched her face work, the assessment running behind her eyes, the rapid re-evaluation of a brief that had been written around a different situation than the one she was standing in. "You understand," she said slowly, "that the order was issued by a majority of the Wisengamot, I understand the order was issued by people who had incomplete information, Harry said. I'm not suggesting they were wrong to be concerned. I'm providing the complete information. He paused. You have the authority to withdraw the order based on direct assessment. That's why you're here instead of the whole Wizengamot. He tilted his head slightly. What does your assessment say? She looked at him for a very long moment. Then she looked at Percy, and Percy could see her rereading the situation: the beach, the sea, the boy at the waterline, the son of Poseidon and the Asgardian god behind him, and above on the cliff path a figure she'd probably recognized as Loki and was choosing not to address because there was no profitable way to address Loki on a cliff path before breakfast. I'll need verification, she said. Of the Vanir assessment. Frigga of Asgard's confirmation in a form that the Wizengamot will accept. I can have that within the hour, Percy said, looking at Thor. Within the hour, Thor confirmed. She looked at Harry again. She was doing the thing people did when they'd come in expecting one thing and found another, not destabilized, but honestly recalibrating, which Percy respected. She was intelligent. She'd looked at Harry and looked at her brief and looked at the math and was arriving somewhere honest. The decree for the reasonable restriction of magical creatures, she said, to Harry directly, was not designed for someone who can explain themselves, Harry said. For someone like you, she said, and it wasn't a compliment and wasn't not one. The wizarding world has no framework that adequately, then they should make one, Harry said, simply. I'm not the only one who doesn't fit the existing categories. I'm probably just the first one who knew what questions to ask. He looked at the sea briefly, then back at her. I don't want to fight the wizarding world. I have a lot of it still to learn. But I need to learn it as myself, with my power, not bound and managed. And he stopped, and for the first time in the conversation something moved in his face that was less than completely composed, a flash of something real and briefly young. Not put away somewhere small, he said. The beach held the sentence. Crouch looked at Harry. Percy watched something move through her face that was more than professional assessment, something that had a quality of personal recognition in it, the flash of someone who had put themselves away somewhere small at some point and remembered it. She looked at her two flanking wizards. Both of them were doing the thing junior officials did when the situation had exceeded the brief and they were waiting for the senior person to tell them where they were. Give me a moment, she said to Percy. She walked 10 feet away, not far, just the deliberate creation of a consultation space, and stood with her back to them looking at the sea. Percy watched her shoulders and the set of her head and the way she held the scroll that contained the provisional binding order, and he thought about what it took to walk into a situation with institutional authority and choose to use it honestly. She turned back. The order will be withdrawn, she said, subject to verification of the Asgardian assessment and a formal registration of Harry's heritage in a new category, which I will personally petition the Wizengamot to create. The process will take approximately 4 weeks. Acceptable, Annabeth said, from her rock, in the tone of someone who had been drafting conditions in her notebook throughout this exchange. Crouch looked at Annabeth. You are. Annabeth Chase, Annabeth said. I'll be preparing the documentation for the new category registration. I'll need a Wizengamot contact. Crouch looked at her for a moment with the expression of someone who had been surprised twice in 10 minutes and was reassessing the entire cast of characters. I'll be your contact, she said. Good, Annabeth said, and wrote it down. Crouch looked at Harry one last time. You will need to engage with the wizarding world eventually, she said, not as a threat, as a fact, offered honestly. Hogwarts. The community. The thing in your scar, when the time comes. I know, Harry said. It will not all go as smoothly as this, she said, and there was a dry quality in her voice that was the closest thing to personal warmth she'd shown. Nothing does, Harry said. That's okay. She looked at him for a moment with the expression of someone who is going to think about this conversation for a long time. Then she apparat away, and her two flanking wizards went after her, and the beach was theirs again. Harry stood at the waterline for a moment. Then he turned around and looked at all of them, at Percy with his hand still near riptide out of habit, at Thor who was exhaling something significant, at Annabeth who was already writing, at Loki descending the cliff path with the particular careful ease of someone who had not intervened and was genuinely pleased about it. "That worked," Harry said. "You worked," Percy said. Harry looked at the sea. "I said what was true," he said. "That's all." "That's everything," Percy said. Harry looked at him. The morning light was fully up now, bright and flat, the sea doing its constant thing, and Harry was standing in it with his piece of sea glass in one hand and the Bifrost fragment in the other, and he was 5 years old and he had just talked a Wisengamot order into withdrawal by being exactly himself. "Percy," he said. "Yeah. I want to practice the water," Harry said. "While we're here." Percy laughed, a real one, sudden and genuine. "Yeah," he said. "Okay." Harry turned to the sea and put one hand out, the low gesture that was his asking shape, and the ocean answered the way it always answered him, fully, immediately, like something that had been waiting. They didn't go back to Surrey. They didn't go back to the lighthouse, which had served its purpose and returned to being a lighthouse. They found a house instead, a proper one, on the North Yorkshire coast, the kind of house that was too large for the usual math of occupants but which Thor paid for with the uncomplicated certainty of someone who had never worried about property prices and wasn't going to start. It had a garden that ran down to a cliff edge and a path to the beach below, and a kitchen large enough for everyone to be in it at the same time without it being an architectural negotiation, and enough bedrooms that everyone had one including Loki, who arrived at the house 3 days after they did and didn't offer an explanation and wasn't asked for one. Harry had a room on the east side, facing the sea. He had, within a week, filled the windowsill with sea glass and Bifrost fragments and 3 rocks from the tidal pool at the lighthouse that Percy had retrieved for him on a solo drive north because Harry had mentioned them in passing and Percy had been in the car before he'd fully decided to go. He had, within 2 weeks, discovered the village library and started working through it with the systematic thoroughness he brought to tidal pools. He had, within a month, negotiated with Annabeth for formal lessons, reading, mathematics, history, the kind of foundational structure that 5-year-olds needed and that Harry was going to cover in approximately half the normal time given the rate at which he processed everything, but which was going to happen properly because Annabeth had very strong feelings about foundations. He had a sword lesson from Brunhilde via enchanted video call, which was Thor's arrangement and which had taken Percy a moment to adjust to, a Valkyrie on a screen demonstrating grip and footwork while Harry watched with total focus and practiced in the kitchen, which resulted in 1 broken chair and a very memorable morning, and which Harry treated with the seriousness of a professional commitment. He trained with Percy every morning on the beach. The water work was advancing into territory that Percy was starting to find genuinely challenging to construct exercises for, which was the specific and satisfying problem of teaching someone whose rate of development outran the standard curriculum. He was moving larger volumes, maintaining more precision, doing things with the interaction of water and atmosphere that Percy had never thought to try. He was, increasingly, not imitating Percy's techniques but developing his own, which were related but different, shaped by the particular combination of inheritance that was uniquely his. "You're going to surpass me," Percy told him, one morning in October, after Harry had held a 30-foot column of seawater static in a gale for 6 minutes without visible effort. Harry let the column go. He looked at Percy. "Does that bother you?" "No," Percy said, and meant it completely. Harry thought about this. "It would bother some people." "I know," Percy said. "It doesn't bother me." Harry looked at him with those green eyes that didn't miss things. "Because you want me to be as good as I can be," he said, "not as good as makes you comfortable." "Yeah," Percy said. Harry nodded, in the way that meant he was adding something to a list of things he was going to remember. The scar work continued, weekly sessions with Frigga when she visited, and air once a month via the Bifrost, which Thor made routine. Slow, precise, going at the pace that Harry's own magic set rather than the pace anyone else determined. The cold spot was isolating, gradually, the boundary between it and Harry becoming more defined with each session. Harry described it, at the end of October, as feeling like the cold spot had moved from inside me to near me, which Frigga and Air agreed was exactly the right progression and better than they'd expected. Dumbledore came once. Just once, in September, and he came alone and walked down to the beach where Harry was practicing, and he sat on a rock at a respectful distance and watched, and Harry let him watch, and after a while Harry came and sat a few feet from him. They talked for an hour. Percy stayed at the cliff path. He didn't hear what they said. When Harry came back up to the house he was thoughtful for the rest of the afternoon, and in the evening Percy asked if he was okay. "He's very alone," Harry said. "Yeah," Percy said. "His plan is very important to him," Harry said. "More important than most things." "But it doesn't, there aren't people in it. Only positions. Only what people need to be in order for the plan to work." He looked at the sea glass on his windowsill. "He was kind to me," he said. "Genuinely. And I still think he was wrong, and I think he knows it, and I think he's lonely in that knowing." Percy sat with this. "What did you tell him?" "I told him the plan can change," Harry said. "That a good outcome doesn't need a fixed path, just a true direction." He paused. "I don't know if he believed me." "You said it," Percy said. "That's enough. He'll think about it." Harry looked out at the evening sea. "He might come back," he said. "He might," Percy said. "That's okay," Harry said. "He can come back." Percy looked at him. At the 5-year-old who had been told he was nothing and had decided otherwise, who had walked into the Wisengamot's authority and talked it down with plain truth, who was extending this uncomplicated door to one of the most powerful wizards alive, not from naivety but from the specific kind of generosity that knows itself to be generous and does it anyway. "Yeah," Percy said. "He can." It was November when everything settled into the shape it was going to hold for a while. Not resolved, Percy had stopped expecting resolution, which was a maturity he credited to the last 5 years of his life and the last 4 months specifically. But settled, the way Harry had said at the service station, settled and not stopped, still moving, still growing, but with a shape to it now, a structure, the kind of architecture that held weight over time. The house was full on a Sunday in November, which had not been planned. Annabeth was at the kitchen table with 3 books and her notebook. Thor was in the garden examining the fence, which had been damaged in a training session and which he appeared to be personally affronted by. Loki was in the sitting room reading something and pretending not to listen to everything. Frigga had come for the weekend and was in conversation with Air over an enchanted communication channel that Loki had set up with a specific neutrality of expression suggesting he was pleased with the result but declining to show it. Percy was on the cliff path with Harry. Harry had his notebook, Annabeth had given him his own, a proper one, blue cover, and he was drawing the sea in the low November light, which was the kind of light that made everything very real, very present, every texture specific. He was getting better at the drawing. His lines had the quality of someone who was learning to look before they marked, learning the difference between what they expected to see and what was there. "Percy," Harry said, drawing. "Yeah. What's going to happen when I go to Hogwarts?" he said, the same direct, practical tone he used for questions that had weight. "When I'm older." Percy had been thinking about this for months and had not arrived anywhere conclusive, which was honest, so he said it honestly. "I don't know exactly. But you'll go as yourself. You'll have been yourself for years by then. Whatever they expect, whatever they've planned, it's not going to be what they get." Harry was quiet for a moment, drawing. "I'm not afraid of it," he said. "Hogwarts. The wizarding world. I know. I was thinking about what Crouch said," Harry said. "About how I'm probably not the only one who doesn't fit the existing categories." He looked at the sea. "If I can make them make a new category for me, maybe I can make them make new categories for other things too. Other people." Percy looked at him. At the notebook with its careful sea drawing, at the blue winter light in his eyes, at the scar on his forehead that was less cold now, more contained, more specifically not hairy than it had ever been. "Maybe," Percy said. "I think about what Loki said," Harry said. What happened first? The anger. Things happen to people and then the people become the thing that happened to them because no one asked what happened first. He looked at his drawing. Someone should ask. Yeah, Percy said. Someone should. Harry looked at the sea for a moment. Then he opened his hand and let the water respond, quietly, just a small sphere, the first exercise Percy had ever given him, the one from the first morning on this beach. It rose and rotated and caught the November light in it. I like this one, Harry said. It was the first. Yeah, Percy said. It was. Harry looked at the sphere and at the sea and at the house above the cliff path where the lights were on in the kitchen and the sitting room and the smell of something cooking had been drifting down for the last 20 minutes. He looked at all of it with the open, unguarded look that had taken 4 months of consistency to become his default instead of the thing he only let out briefly. Percy, he said. Yeah. Thank you for knocking, he said. Percy looked at him. At the 5-year-old who had pressed his hand against a cupboard vent because it was the only sky he had, who had asked if pasta was too expensive, who had said hello to the ocean like it was an old friend and been answered, who had stood in the throne room of Asgard and told the All-Father he was working on being bigger, who had dissolved a Wisengamot order with plain truth, who was sitting on a cliff path in November drawing the sea with the focused pleasure of someone who had decided to be alive in each thing they did. Thanks for opening the door, Percy said. Harry let the sphere go back to the sea. He closed his notebook. He stood up and looked at the house, the lights in the windows, the shapes visible through the glass of the people inside. Then he started up the path to the house, and Percy fell in beside him, and November was cold around them and the sea was loud behind them and the path was uneven and the grass was wet, and Harry slid his hand into Percy's without ceremony, without asking, without any of the careful provisional quality that hand-holding had carried in the first weeks, just because it was there and because it was right and because he was going home. The lights of the house came down the path toward them. Inside the warm kitchen, Annabeth was saying something to Loki about structural support systems and Loki was responding with a specific irritation that meant she'd hit something interesting, and Thor was coming in from the garden and asking what was for dinner, and Frigga was laughing at something Air had said, and the house held all of it easily, the way good houses did, the ones built with the right foundations. Percy opened the door. Harry walked in. The warmth of the house closed around him and he went directly to the kitchen table and sat next to Annabeth and opened his notebook to a fresh page, and the light fell on the table and on the people around it and on the piece of Bifrost glass that had migrated from his windowsill to the kitchen and lived now in a bowl of sea glass at the table's center, all the colors of it moving continuously in the kitchen light, quiet and alive. Outside, the sea came in and went out. It had always known he was there. It would always know. And somewhere in the 9 realms, in a sideways place that wasn't quite anywhere but was adjacent to everywhere, the thing in Harry's scar pressed against its containment one time, testing, the way it always tested now with decreasing result. And Harry's magic, the ocean and the storm and the old Vanir gold thread, held. Completely. Without effort. Like it had never considered doing anything else.